Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I was on a solo road trip across the country, enjoying the freedom and the open road. I had been driving for hours and decided to take a break. I pulled over at a rest stop to stretch my legs. As I was getting back into my car, a man approached me, asking for a ride. He looked harmless enough, maybe in his mid-30s, with a friendly smile. He said his name was Jack and that he needed to get to the next town. I hesitated for a moment but then agreed, thinking it would be nice to have some company for a while. He thanked me and got in the passenger seat. We started driving, and at first, everything seemed fine. We talked about the weather, our travels, and the places we had been. He seemed friendly and normal. After about an hour, his demeanor started to change. He became quiet, staring out the window. I tried to make conversation, but he gave short, curt answers. Then he began to make strange comments about the other cars on the road and the people we passed. He said things like, "I wonder what it would be like to just disappear, and you never know what people are hiding." I felt a knot form in my stomach. Something was off about him. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye and saw that he was watching me closely. His smile had disappeared, replaced by a hard, cold look. I decided to stop at the next gas station, thinking I could get him out of my car there. I told him I needed to use the restroom and pulled into a small, rundown gas station. He agreed to wait in the car, but as I got out, he grabbed my arm. "Don't take too long," he said, his grip tight. "We have places to be." I nodded, my heart pounding, and went inside. I looked around for help but saw no one. The place was deserted. I splashed water on my face, trying to calm down, and thought about my options. I couldn't just leave him in my car, and I didn't want to confront him directly. When I came back out, he was standing by the car, smoking a cigarette. He tossed it aside when he saw me and got back in. I forced a smile and got back behind the wheel. As we drove, he became more agitated. He started talking about how he didn't trust anyone and how people always lied to him. His voice grew louder and more aggressive. I tried to stay calm, agreeing with him and trying to keep the situation from escalating. I saw a sign for a police station in the next town and decided to head there. I hoped I could get help without him realizing what I was doing. I told him I needed to make a quick stop and he glared at me but didn't say anything. When we reached the town, I drove towards the police station. He noticed and started to panic. "Why are we going here?" he demanded, his voice rising. "I just need to ask for directions," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't believe me. He grabbed the steering wheel, trying to pull the car off the road. I fought to keep control, my heart racing. I managed to swerve into the police station parking lot and slammed on the brakes. Before he could react, I jumped out of the car and ran towards the building, shouting for help. He followed, but two officers came out and quickly restrained him. They took him inside while I tried to catch my breath. I explained what had happened, and they assured me I was safe now. They told me I had done the right thing by coming to them. They took my statement and said they would handle it from there. I was home alone during summer break. My parents were on a trip, and I had the house to myself. It was late, and I was lying in bed, almost asleep. Suddenly, I heard glass shattering downstairs. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to listen. I thought it might be a dream, but then I heard footsteps. I got out of bed quietly and crept to my bedroom door. I opened it a crack and peeked out into the hallway. It was dark and silent, but I could hear the faint sounds of movement downstairs. I needed to get my phone to call the police, but I had left it in the living room. I cursed myself for being so careless. I tiptoed out of my room and headed for the stairs, careful to avoid the creaky spots on the floor. As I got closer to the stairs, I heard voices. Two men were talking in hushed tones. They sounded like they were searching for something. I crouched down and peeked through the banister. I could see shadows moving in the living room. I needed to find a way to get to my phone without being seen. I decided to go through the kitchen, which had a door that led to the living room. I slowly made my way downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the kitchen and paused, listening. The men were still in the living room, their voices low but urgent. I moved quietly, inching towards the kitchen door. I opened it slowly, hoping it wouldn't creak. I could see the living room now. One of the men was rummaging through drawers, while the other was looking at the shelves. My phone was on the coffee table, just a few feet away from them. I took a deep breath and crawled on the floor, staying as low as possible. I moved slowly, my eyes never leaving the burglars. I was almost at the coffee table when one of them turned around. I froze, my heart stopping. He looked right at me, but he didn't seem to see me. I stayed perfectly still, praying he wouldn't notice. After a moment, he turned back to his search. I reached the coffee table and grabbed my phone. I crawled back to the kitchen, my heart still racing. I made it to the kitchen and closed the door behind me as quietly as I could. I dialed 911, my hands shaking. I whispered to the operator, telling them about the burglars. They said they would send officers right away and told me to stay hidden. I found a spot behind the kitchen counter where I could watch the living room door. I waited, my phone clutched in my hand. The burglars were still searching, oblivious to my presence. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. I heard one of the burglars say they needed to hurry up. They sounded frustrated, like they weren't finding what they were looking for. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. The burglars heard them too and panicked. They grabbed a few things and ran towards the back door. I stayed hidden, not daring to move. I heard the back door slam and the sound of footsteps running away. The sirens grew louder, and soon I saw flashing lights outside. The police had arrived. I stayed behind the counter until I heard the police calling out, announcing their presence. I stood up and walked to the front door, my legs shaky. I opened the door and saw two officers standing there. They asked if I was okay, and I nodded, feeling a rush of relief. I told them what had happened, and they searched the house to make sure the burglars were gone. They took my statement and said they would investigate. I called my parents and told them what had happened. They were worried but glad I was safe. I spent the rest of the night in a daze, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. The police never caught the burglars, but they said I did the right thing by staying hidden and calling for help. It was a terrifying experience, and I was just glad it was over. I was home one evening, just relaxing after work. My phone buzzed, and I picked it up, expecting a message from a friend or some random notification. Instead, there was a text from an unknown number. It said, "Nice book you're reading." I glanced around, feeling a bit uneasy, but then brushed it off as a weird prank. I didn't think much of it and went back to my book. The next day, I got another text from the same number. This time it said, "Red really suits you." I was wearing a red dress. My heart started pounding. I walked over to the window, looked outside, and saw nothing unusual. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. That evening, I got another text. Dinner looks delicious. I was making pasta. I dropped the spoon and looked around my apartment, my hands shaking. It felt like someone was in the room with me, watching every move I made. I checked all the windows and doors, making sure they were locked. The texts kept coming, describing everything I did. You should get some rest. I was heading to bed. Nice pajamas. I was wearing my favorite PJs. I felt trapped in my own home, like there was no escape from whoever was watching me. I couldn't see any cameras or signs of someone being inside, but I felt their eyes on me all the time. I called my friend Jenny and told her what was happening. She was worried and offered to come over, but I told her I would be fine. I didn't want to drag anyone else into this mess. I decided to try and figure it out on my own. I stayed up all night, trying to find any clues, but there was nothing. Just more texts. The next day, I went to the police. They took my report but said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. They told me to stay safe and contact them if anything escalated. I felt helpless and frustrated. The texts continued, getting more personal and detailed. You look tired. I hadn't slept in days. That's a beautiful necklace. I was wearing a necklace my mom gave me. You can't hide from me. I was curled up in the corner of my bedroom, feeling more terrified than ever. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started looking around my apartment again, more carefully this time. I checked behind picture frames, under furniture, and inside every little nook and cranny. Finally, I found a small camera hidden inside a vent in the living room. It was positioned to see almost the entire apartment. I felt sick to my stomach. I took the camera to the police, hoping they could trace it back to whoever was behind this. They said they would investigate, but it would take time. Meanwhile, the texts kept coming. Nice find. The stalker knew I found the camera. I felt more vulnerable than ever. I decided to stay at a hotel for a few nights, hoping to get away from the constant surveillance. But the texts followed me there too. Room 302, nice choice. My blood ran cold. I was no longer safe anywhere. I called Jenny again, and she insisted on staying with me. We both felt safer together, but the texts kept coming, describing everything we did. Having a friend over, I see. We tried to block the number, but new ones kept appearing. Desperate, we started searching online for any information that could help us. We found stories of other people experiencing similar things, but no clear solutions. We felt lost and scared. The texts became more threatening. You can't escape. I'm always watching. One night, while Jenny and I were talking, I got a text saying, "Look outside." We hesitated, but then peeked through the curtains. A figure was standing across the street, staring at my apartment. I couldn't make out their face, but I knew it was the stalker. We called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the figure was gone. Feeling completely trapped, we decided to stay with Jenny's brother, who lived out of town. We hoped the distance would help. For a few days, it was quiet. No texts, no signs of being watched. I started to relax, thinking it might finally be over. Then, one evening, a text came through. Nice place. The stalker had found us again. I felt like breaking down, but Jenny's brother, Mark, was determined to help. He had a background in security and promised to keep us safe. He set up cameras around his house and made sure all the doors and windows were secure. We stayed vigilant, waiting for any sign of the stalker. One night, we heard a noise outside. Mark checked the cameras and saw a figure trying to tamper with one of them. He called the police and went outside with a baseball bat to confront them. The stalker ran off before Mark could get a good look, but the police arrived quickly and started a search. They found a car parked a few blocks away with equipment inside for surveillance. The car was traced back to a man who had a history of stalking and harassment. He was arrested, and we finally felt a sense of relief. The police told us it would take time to gather enough evidence for a conviction, but at least he was off the streets for now. I moved to a new apartment with better security and kept in close contact with Jenny and Mark. The texts stopped, and I started to feel safe again. It took time to rebuild my sense of security, but I knew I had strong people around me to help. Last night, around 11 p.m., my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so it startled me. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. There was a man in a delivery uniform holding a package. I hadn't ordered anything, so I hesitated. I cracked the door open, just a bit, and asked what he wanted. He said he had a delivery for me. I told him I didn't order anything and tried to close the door. He put his foot in the way and insisted he had to drop off the package inside. My heart started pounding. Something didn't feel right. I firmly told him I wouldn't let him in and tried to shut the door again. He pushed back harder this time, almost forcing the door open. I used all my strength to keep it closed and told him to leave. He got angry and started shouting that he needed to come inside. I was terrified. I managed to push the door enough to lock it and ran to grab my phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. I told the operator what was happening, and she assured me help was on the way. I could hear the man banging on my door, yelling threats. I checked all the windows and doors, making sure they were locked. The banging grew louder, and I heard something smash. I rushed to the kitchen and saw the window was broken. Panic set in as I realized he was trying to break in. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer and hid in the pantry, trying to stay quiet. I could hear him moving around outside, trying to find another way in. I kept telling myself the police would arrive soon, but every second felt like an hour. Then, I heard the front door being kicked. The wood splintered, and I knew he was inside. My breath caught in my throat, and I tried to stay as silent as possible. I could hear his footsteps getting closer, searching each room. He called out, taunting me, saying he would find me. I held the knife tightly, praying he wouldn't come into the kitchen. I heard him rummaging through my living room, knocking things over. The sound of sirens in the distance gave me a sliver of hope. But then the footsteps stopped right outside the pantry door. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. The doorknob turned slowly, and I braced myself. Suddenly, he flung the door open and lunged at me. I screamed and swung the knife wildly. He grabbed my wrist, trying to wrestle it away. I kicked and struggled, using all my strength to fight him off. The sirens were getting louder, but I didn't know if they'd make it in time. We tumbled out of the pantry, and I managed to break free. I ran towards the front door, but he caught my ankle, and I fell hard. Pain shot through my leg, but I kicked at him desperately. I could see the red and blue lights flashing outside my window. With one final kick, I broke free and crawled towards the door. The police burst in just as he was about to grab me again. They tackled him to the ground and handcuffed him. Relief washed over me, and I collapsed, sobbing. The police helped me up and checked me for injuries. They said I was lucky to have called when I did. They found out the man wasn't a real delivery person. He had been targeting women in the area, using the same tactic to get inside their homes. I gave my statement, still shaking from the ordeal. The police assured me he would be locked up for a long time. They called a locksmith to fix my door and stayed until I felt safe. The forest was quiet, and I enjoyed the solitude. After a few hours, I realized I had lost the trail. My phone had no signal, and I began to worry. I tried retracing my steps, but everything looked the same. As the sun began to set, I spotted a cabin hidden among the trees. Relieved, I approached it, hoping to find help. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. The place looked abandoned, but the door was unlocked. I decided to go inside. The cabin was dark and smelled musty. There was old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. I called out, but there was no response. I found a flashlight on a table and turned it on. The beam of light revealed more of the cabin, and I noticed strange things. There were maps and photos pinned to the walls. The photos showed people who looked scared or hurt. My stomach churned. I went into another room and found a table with tools that looked like they were used for torture. My heart raced, and I felt sick. I knew I had to leave, but I heard footsteps outside. Panic set in. I turned off the flashlight and hid behind a large cabinet. The door creaked open, and I heard voices. 2 men entered, talking in low, angry tones. They mentioned someone escaping and needing to find them. I stayed as still as I could, trying to control my breathing. The men moved around the cabin, and I could hear them getting closer. One of them stopped near the cabinet. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find me. After a tense moment, they moved on. They discussed plans to search the forest in the morning. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to escape. When they went into another room, I quietly moved to the door. I peeked out and saw them busy with something, giving me a chance to slip out. I made my way back into the forest, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The darkness made it hard to see, and I stumbled several times. I kept going, fearing they would discover I was gone and come after me. The forest seemed endless. I heard rustling behind me and froze. The men were looking for me with flashlights. I ducked behind a tree, hoping they wouldn't see me. They passed by, their lights cutting through the darkness. I waited until they were far enough away before moving again. Hours passed, and I felt exhausted. My legs were sore, and my throat was dry. I didn't know if I was going in the right direction, but I kept moving. The sky began to lighten as dawn approached, giving me a bit more visibility. I found a stream and drank some water, trying to gather my strength. I heard voices again and knew the men were still searching. I followed the stream, hoping it would lead me to safety. The sound of water helped mask my footsteps. Eventually, I saw it clearing up ahead. My heart lifted with hope. As I got closer, I saw a road. Relief washed over me. I climbed up to the road and looked around. There was no sign of the men. I started walking, hoping to find help soon. After what felt like hours, I saw a car approaching. I waved frantically, and it stopped. The driver looked concerned and asked if I was okay. I told him everything in a rush, and he offered to take me to the nearest town. I gratefully accepted. We arrived at the town, and I went straight to the police. I told them about the cabin and the men. They took my statement and said they would investigate. I felt a mix of relief and fear, hoping the men would be caught. The power went out around 9 p.m. I was home alone, just settling in for the night. I lit a few candles and tried to relax, but the silence felt thick. Every little noise seemed louder in the darkness. I decided to get my flashlight from the drawer in the kitchen. As I made my way through the living room, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. My heart skipped a beat. I hoped it was just a neighbor, but the footsteps stopped right in front of my door. Then came the knocking. It was frantic, almost desperate. My stomach tightened. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no answer, just more knocking. I felt a chill run down my spine. The knocking turned into pounding, and I could hear someone jiggling the doorknob. I knew I had to act fast. I moved as quietly as I could to the door and double-checked the lock. It was secure, but I knew it wouldn't hold if someone really wanted to get in. I needed something to barricade the door. My mind raced as I tried to think of what I could use. The sofa was too heavy, and the dining chairs seemed too flimsy. The pounding on the door grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed the nearest chair and wedged it under the doorknob. It wasn't much, but it was something. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to find a place to hide. I made my way to the bedroom, keeping my steps as quiet as possible. I felt my way along the wall, my flashlight still in the kitchen where I'd left it. I cursed under my breath for not grabbing it sooner. The darkness was oppressive, and I felt vulnerable. In the bedroom, I closed the door softly behind me and locked it. I went to the window, thinking I might signal for help, but the blackout had plunged the whole city into darkness. There was no one outside, no lights, no movement. Just an eerie stillness. The pounding at the front door stopped suddenly. I strained my ears, listening for any sound. Then I heard footsteps again, moving away from my apartment. I breathed a small sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. The footsteps returned, stopping at my bedroom door. A new wave of fear washed over me. I could hear breathing on the other side of the door, heavy and ragged. The doorknob turned slowly, but the lock held. I backed away, my mind racing. I needed a weapon. Something to defend myself. I grabbed a heavy lamp from the bedside table and held it tightly, my hands trembling. The person on the other side of the door started pounding again, shouting something I couldn't make out. It sounded angry, desperate. I prayed the door would hold. I looked around the room, trying to think of an escape route. The window was the only option, but I was on the 5th floor. There was no fire escape, no way down. I felt trapped, like a cornered animal. I had to stay calm, think clearly. The pounding continued, relentless. I knew the door wouldn't hold forever. I moved to the closet, thinking I might hide inside. But it felt too obvious, too confined. I needed to be able to move, to defend myself if it came to that. Then, the pounding stopped again. Silence. I held my breath, waiting. The silence stretched on, unbearable. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in my ears. I crept closer to the door, trying to listen for any sign of movement. Suddenly, I heard a crash from the living room. The sound of breaking glass. My heart leaped into my throat. They were inside. I tightened my grip on the lamp, ready to swing if I had to. I heard footsteps again, moving through the apartment, searching. The footsteps came closer, stopping right outside the bedroom door. The doorknob turned again, more forcefully this time. The door shuddered under the pressure, but the lock held. I prayed it would keep holding. I needed a plan, something to get me out of this. Then, an idea came to me. I remembered the fire escape ladder in the hallway outside my apartment. If I could get out there, I might have a chance. But I had to get past whoever was trying to break in. It was risky, but I didn't have a choice. I took a deep breath and unlocked the bedroom door. I flung it open, swinging the lamp at the figure standing there. I heard a grunt of pain as the lamp connected, and I didn't wait to see who it was. I ran for the front door, my heart pounding. I threw the chair aside and yanked the door open. I sprinted down the hallway to the fire escape ladder. My hands fumbled with the latch, my mind screaming at me to hurry. I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer. Finally, the latch gave way, and I pulled the ladder down. I climbed as fast as I could, my muscles burning with the effort. I didn't look back, didn't want to see how close they were. I just kept climbing, higher and higher. When I reached the roof, I ran to the edge, looking for a way down. There was another ladder leading to the ground, and I didn't hesitate. I climbed down, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. I felt a surge of relief as I reached the ground. I ran to the nearest building, pounding on the door, shouting for help. Lights flickered on inside, and I heard someone moving. The door opened, and a man looked at me with concern. I told him what had happened, and he called the police. The police arrived quickly, and I told them everything. They searched my apartment but didn't find anyone. They said the person must have escaped when I climbed the fire escape. They assured me they would investigate, but I knew I wouldn't feel safe there again. I packed a bag and stayed with a friend for a while. The memory of that night haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Megan and I were driving to a family reunion, and somehow we took a wrong turn. The GPS lost signal, and we found ourselves on a narrow, winding road surrounded by thick woods. It was getting dark, and we were completely lost. The car started making strange noises, and soon enough, it broke down. We pulled over near an old, run-down house that looked abandoned. I didn't want to leave the car, but we had no choice. There was no cell service to call for help, so we decided to check if anyone was in the house. We walked up to the front door and knocked. There was no answer. The windows were dark, and the place looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. I tried the door handle, and to my surprise, it opened. We stepped inside, calling out for anyone who might be there. The inside of the house was as creepy as the outside. Dust covered everything, and the air felt thick and musty. There were old, broken pieces of furniture and tattered curtains hanging from the windows. We called out again, but still, no answer. As we were about to leave, an old woman appeared at the top of the stairs. She looked frail and worn out. She said she lived there alone and rarely had visitors. Megan explained our situation, and the old woman offered to let us use her phone. We followed her into a dimly lit room. The phone looked ancient, but it had a dial tone. I started dialing for a tow truck, but the call wouldn't go through. The old woman said the phone lines were unreliable and suggested we stay the night until we could get help in the morning. Reluctantly, we agreed. She showed us to a room upstairs with 2 small beds. It was cold and smelled of mildew, but we were too tired to argue. We locked the door and tried to get some rest. Megan fell asleep quickly, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creak. In the middle of the night, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They stopped right outside our door. My heart pounded in my chest. I got up quietly and peered through the keyhole. I saw the old woman standing there, just staring at our door. I woke Megan up and whispered what I saw. We decided to stay quiet and pretend to be asleep. After a while, the footsteps continued down the hall, and we heard a door creak open and shut. We stayed awake, too scared to move. At dawn, we decided to leave the house and walk back to the main road. As we were packing our things, we heard the old woman talking to someone downstairs. We peeked out and saw a man with a rough, menacing look. They were whispering, and it didn't seem friendly. We quietly slipped out of the room and made our way down the stairs. The floorboards creaked loudly, and the old woman and the man turned to look at us. Their expressions were cold and hostile. The man stepped towards us, and we bolted for the door. We ran through the woods, not knowing where we were going. We just needed to get away from that house. We could hear them shouting behind us, but we didn't stop. We stumbled through the underbrush, branches scratching our arms and faces. Eventually, we found a small clearing and stopped to catch our breath. We were completely lost, but we knew we couldn't go back. We kept moving, hoping to find a road or a house where we could get help. Hours passed, and we were exhausted and hungry. Just when we were about to give up, we saw a dirt road ahead. We followed it and eventually came to a small farmhouse. The people there were kind and let us use their phone. We called for a tow truck and waited there until it arrived. The tow truck driver took us back to our car and fixed it up. We didn't mention the house or the old woman. We just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. We finally made it to the family reunion, but we didn't talk about what happened. It felt too surreal, too terrifying. Megan and I never took that route again. I was in town for a business presentation and checked into a hotel near the conference center. The room seemed nice enough, and I started unpacking my things. I was a bit nervous about the presentation, so I decided to practice my speech in front of the mirror. As I was going through my notes, I noticed a small, blinking light in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was a smoke detector or some kind of sensor. But then I realized it was coming from a tiny hole in the wall. I got closer and saw a small lens inside. It was a camera, and it was pointed directly at the bed. My heart started racing. Someone had been watching me. I felt exposed and violated. I tried to think logically about what to do next. I didn't want to stay in the room, but I also didn't want to make a scene without being sure. I took a deep breath and decided to call the front desk. I told them there was something wrong with my room and asked if someone could come up. A few minutes later, a man from maintenance knocked on the door. I showed him the camera, and he looked shocked. He said he would report it to the manager right away. The manager came up shortly after and apologized profusely. He said they had no idea how the camera got there and assured me they would investigate. He offered me a different room and some free meals as compensation. I didn't feel much better, but I didn't have a choice. I needed to stay for the presentation. I moved to the new room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I checked every corner, every vent, and every piece of furniture. I found nothing, but I still felt uneasy. I tried to focus on my presentation, but my mind kept drifting back to the camera. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump. I kept thinking about who could have put the camera there and why. I decided I had to do something more. I couldn't just let it go. In the morning, I went to the manager again. I demanded to know what they had found out. He said they were still investigating but hadn't discovered anything yet. He assured me they took my privacy seriously and were doing everything they could. I didn't believe him. I felt like they were just trying to cover it up. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I went to the local police station and reported what I had found. They took my statement and said they would look into it. Back at the hotel, I felt even more paranoid. I knew someone was watching me, but I didn't know or why. I stayed in my room as much as possible and avoided interacting with anyone. I kept my curtains closed and didn't use the hotel Wi-Fi. The next day, I had my presentation. It went well, but I could hardly concentrate. I kept looking at the audience, wondering if the person behind the camera was there, watching me. After it was over, I went straight back to my room. That evening, there was a knock on my door. It was the police. They said they had found something. They asked if they could come in and talk. I let them in, and they told me they had found more cameras in other rooms. It wasn't just me. There were at least 3 other rooms with hidden cameras. They said they were questioning the staff and reviewing security footage. They asked if I had noticed anyone suspicious. I hadn't. I felt a bit of relief knowing it wasn't just me, but I was still scared. I didn't feel safe in the hotel anymore. The police left, and I packed my things. I decided to check out and stay somewhere else. As I was leaving, the manager tried to apologize again, but I didn't want to hear it. I just wanted to get out of there. I found another hotel on the other side of town. It was smaller and less fancy, but I felt safer. I checked the room thoroughly before unpacking and didn't find anything suspicious. I finally felt like I could relax a bit. The police called me a few days later. They said they had arrested a member of the hotel staff. He had been planting the cameras and watching the footage. They found recordings of several guests, including me. I felt sick knowing someone had been spying on me like that. I thanked the police for their work and hung up. I still felt uneasy, but at least I knew the person behind it was caught. I finished my business trip and went home, but the experience stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and I was extra cautious whenever I stayed in a hotel after that. It was a terrifying experience, and it took me a long time to feel safe again. I took my boat out for a solo trip, hoping for a peaceful day on the water. The weather was perfect, and I felt relaxed as I sailed far from shore. The sea was calm, and there was no one else around, just the way I liked it. A few hours into my trip, I noticed another vessel in the distance. It had no lights on, which seemed odd. Boats usually have lights on, even during the day. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to get a closer look. As I approached, I saw men moving around on the deck. They were carrying boxes and seemed to be in a hurry. When I got close enough, I realized they were transferring cargo from their boat to another smaller one. The closer I got, the more I noticed something was off. The men were armed. They had guns slung over their shoulders and looked tense. My heart started pounding, and I knew I had to get out of there. I tried to turn my boat around quietly, but the engine sputtered. The noise caught their attention, and I saw one of the men point in my direction. Panic set in, and I fumbled with the controls, trying to get the boat moving. They started shouting and waving their arms. One of them fired a shot into the air. My boat finally started, and I sped away as fast as I could. I kept looking back, terrified they were following me. I didn't see them anymore, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I had to get to shore and report what I saw. I kept my eyes on the horizon, hoping to spot land soon. My hands were shaking, and I could hardly keep the boat steady. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the shoreline. Relief washed over me, but I didn't slow down. I needed to get to a marina or somewhere with people. I needed help. When I reached the marina, I jumped out of the boat and ran to the nearest person I could find. I told them what I saw, and they called the police. I was out of breath and could hardly speak, but I managed to explain everything. The police arrived quickly, and I gave them a full statement. They took me seriously, which was a relief. They said they would send a team to investigate the area where I saw the other boat. I stayed at the marina, waiting for news. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if they had caught me. The police came back later and said they found evidence of illegal activity but no sign of the men or their boats. They thanked me for reporting it and said they would continue investigating. I was still shaken but felt a bit safer knowing they were on it. I decided to stay off the water for a while and let things settle down. The experience haunted me for days. I kept replaying it in my mind, thinking of all the ways it could have gone wrong. I was grateful to be safe, but knew I had to be more cautious in the future. Eventually, I went back to my normal routine, but I never forgot that day. It was a stark reminder of how quickly things can go from peaceful to dangerous. I made sure to be more aware of my surroundings and trust my instincts. I still loved being on the water, but I was always on guard. I installed better equipment on my boat and made sure I had a reliable way to communicate in case of emergencies. The sea was still my escape, but I respected its unpredictability. Life went on, and I found joy in my trips again. The fear faded, but the lessons stayed with me. I knew I was lucky to have gotten away safely and didn't take that for granted. Each trip was a reminder to stay vigilant and prepared. In the end, I was just grateful to have another chance to enjoy the things I loved. I never saw those men again, and I hope they were caught and brought to justice. I took my daughter, Emma, to the park. It was a sunny day, and the park was filled with children playing and parents chatting. I watched Emma run around, her laughter mixing with the sounds of the park. I felt relaxed, enjoying the moment. I noticed a man standing near a tree. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe he was waiting for someone. But he kept glancing at Emma, and something about his gaze made me uneasy. He wasn't watching the other children, just her. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. I kept an eye on him while pretending to focus on Emma. The man started to move closer, still watching her. My heart began to race, and I felt a knot forming in my stomach. Emma ran towards the swings, and the man followed at a distance. I stood up and walked quickly to her. I called her name, and she looked at me with a big smile. I reached her and took her hand, pulling her close. The man stopped, his eyes locking with mine. He had a cold, unsettling look. I picked up Emma and started walking towards the playground's exit. The man began to follow us. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do. I spotted another mom I knew from Emma's preschool. I hurried over to her, trying to keep my voice calm as I asked if we could walk together. She saw the fear in my eyes and agreed without asking questions. The man hesitated, then turned and walked away. I felt a wave of relief but didn't let my guard down. We walked to the parking lot together, and I thanked my friend before heading to my car. I strapped Emma into her car seat, my hands shaking. As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about the man. What if he had managed to get to Emma before I noticed? The thought made me feel sick. I decided to be extra cautious and keep a closer watch on her from now on. A few days later, I took Emma to a different park, hoping to avoid any more encounters. We were playing near the sandbox when I saw him again. He was standing by the entrance, watching us. My heart dropped. I grabbed Emma and headed for the car, trying to stay calm. The man started walking towards us, picking up his pace. I fumbled with my keys, panic setting in. I managed to unlock the car and get Emma inside just as he reached us. He grabbed my arm, and I screamed for help. A nearby jogger heard me and ran over. yelling at the man to back off. The man let go and fled. I thanked the jogger and called the police. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. The police arrived quickly and took my statement. They searched the area but couldn't find the man. They assured me they would keep an eye out and advised me to be cautious. I felt a little better but still shaken. Over the next few days, I was on high alert. Every time I left the house, I looked around nervously. I didn't take Emma to the park or anywhere public. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, watching us. One evening, as I was putting Emma to bed, I heard a noise outside. I peeked through the curtains and saw a figure standing near our fence. My heart pounded as I called the police. They arrived quickly and searched the area again, but found nothing. The police advised me to install security cameras and consider getting a restraining order if I saw him again. I took their advice and set up cameras around the house. I also talked to my neighbors, asking them to keep an eye out. A week later, the cameras caught him lurking near our front door. I called the police, and they finally managed to catch him. He had a record of similar incidents and was arrested. I felt a huge sense of relief knowing he was behind bars. The experience left me shaken, but I was determined to protect my family. I stayed vigilant, always aware of my surroundings. It took a while for the fear to fade, but eventually, I felt safer knowing he was no longer a threat. I still take Emma to the park, but I'm always on guard. I never let her out of my sight and always stay close. The incident taught me to trust my instincts and always be prepared. My family's safety is my top priority, and I won't let anything happen to them again. Life slowly returned to normal, but I'll never forget the fear I felt that day. I reconnected with an old friend from high school named Steve. We hadn't spoken in years, but we caught up over social media. Steve invited me to stay at his farmhouse for the weekend. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway. When I arrived, Steve greeted me warmly. The farmhouse was old but well kept. It stood alone in a vast field, miles from the nearest neighbor. We spent the evening reminiscing about our school days, laughing and drinking. As the night wore on, Steve showed me to the guest room. It was simple, with a bed and a small dresser. I felt uneasy, but I couldn't place why. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe just the years apart that made things feel different. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, and every little creak made me jump. Around midnight, I heard voices coming from downstairs. Curious, I got out of bed and crept towards the door. The voices were clearer now. Steve was talking to someone else, someone I hadn't seen. I opened the door a crack and listened. They were discussing something serious, their tones low and urgent. "You can't let him leave," the other voice said. "He knows too much now." I felt a chill run down my spine. Who were they talking about? I stayed still, trying to hear more. "We'll take care of it in the morning," Steve replied. "Make sure he doesn't suspect anything tonight." My heart pounded. They were talking about me. I had to get out of there. I closed the door quietly and looked around the room for my things. I grabbed my backpack and shoes, moving as silently as I could. I remembered the car keys were downstairs, in the living room. I would have to go down there, past Steve and the other man. I took a deep breath and opened the door again, slipping into the hallway. The stairs creaked under my weight, but the voices in the kitchen masked the sound. I made it to the living room and spotted my keys on the coffee table. I picked them up, my hand trembling. I heard a chair scrape against the floor. They were moving. I had to hurry. I headed for the front door, but it was locked. The key was in the kitchen, where Steve and the other man were. I couldn't risk it. I needed another way out. I remembered the back door in the kitchen. Maybe there was a way to distract them. I looked around and saw the old phone on the wall. I picked it up and dialed 911, but I didn't say anything. I hoped the open line would bring help. I hung up and moved towards the kitchen. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see Steve and the other man standing by the table. I had to create a distraction. I picked up a vase from the table and threw it against the wall. The crash was loud, and the men turned towards the noise. I ducked into the shadows as they walked towards the living room, looking for the source. I slipped into the kitchen and headed for the back door. It was unlocked. I opened it slowly and stepped outside, into the cool night air. I could hear the men searching the living room, their voices angry. I ran towards the barn, hoping to hide there until I could figure out my next move. The barn was dark and smelled of hay. I found a spot behind some old equipment and crouched down, trying to calm my breathing. I listened for any sounds of pursuit, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat. I stayed there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. I heard the sound of a car engine starting, and I peeked out of the barn. The headlights of Steve's truck were on, and he was backing out of the driveway. He was leaving. I had to move quickly. I ran back to the house and grabbed my backpack from the living room. The front door was still locked, but I found a window that was slightly open. I pushed it up and climbed through, scraping my hands on the sill. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys. I started the engine and drove off, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I parked at a gas station and called the police, telling them everything. They took my statement and promised to investigate. They found the farmhouse empty. Steve and the other man were gone, and there was no sign of them. I never heard from Steve again, and I never went back to that farmhouse. Peter and I rented a secluded cabin for a romantic getaway. We were excited to spend some quiet time together, away from the city. The cabin was cozy, surrounded by trees, and far from any neighbors. It felt like our little paradise. The first day was perfect. We hiked, cooked a nice dinner, and enjoyed the peaceful surroundings. By nightfall, we were sitting by the fireplace, talking and laughing. It was the perfect escape. As it got late, we decided to go to bed. The cabin was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves outside. I fell asleep quickly, feeling safe and content. In the middle of the night, I woke up. There was a noise outside, like footsteps crunching on gravel. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the sound was too deliberate. I nudged Peter awake, whispering that I heard something. Peter got up and peered out the window. His face went pale. He motioned for me to come over, and I looked out. A group of men was approaching the cabin. They were carrying weapons, axes, and crowbars. Fear gripped me. We had to hide. We quickly and quietly moved to the closet in the bedroom. I tried to steady my breathing, but my heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they would hear it. Peter held my hand, his grip tight and reassuring. Through a crack in the closet door, I saw the men reach the cabin. They surrounded it, speaking in hushed tones. One of them knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the cabin. When there was no answer, they started trying to force their way in. The front door shook as they tried to break it down. I squeezed Peter's hand, feeling a rush of panic. We needed to signal for help, but we couldn't let them know where we were. Peter had his phone, but there was no signal this deep in the woods. The men got the door open and entered the cabin. I could hear them moving around, their footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. They were ransacking the place, looking for something. I could hear glass breaking and furniture being overturned. Peter whispered that we needed to find a way to call for help. He remembered that there was an old landline phone in the living room, but we would have to get to it without being seen. It was a risky plan, but we had no choice. We waited for a moment when the men were in another part of the cabin. Then we slipped out of the closet and crept towards the living room. I could see the phone on a small table near the window. My heart raced as we moved silently across the room. Just as we reached the phone, one of the men came back into the living room. We ducked behind the couch, holding our breath. He was close, too close. I could hear him breathing, could see his boots from under the couch. He walked past us and went into the kitchen. We seized the opportunity. Peter grabbed the phone and dialed 911. He whispered our location and situation to the operator, praying they could trace the call even if we got cut off. The operator assured us that help was on the way, but we had to stay hidden. We hung up and crawled back towards the bedroom. The men were still searching the cabin, getting more frustrated by the minute. We could hear them arguing. Back in the bedroom, we hid under the bed this time, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Every minute felt like an hour. I clung to Peter, my mind racing with fear. I kept praying that the police would arrive soon. The men were getting more aggressive, smashing things and shouting. It seemed like they were looking for something specific, but we had no idea what. I was terrified they would find us before help arrived. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we heard sirens in the distance. The men heard them too. They cursed and started to leave, running out the front door and disappearing into the woods. I didn't dare move until I heard the sirens right outside the cabin. We crawled out from under the bed as the police burst in, guns drawn. They found us in the bedroom, shaking and scared but unarmed. We told them everything that happened. They searched the area but didn't find the men. The police stayed with us the rest of the night. They said it was likely a group of criminals looking for something hidden in the cabin. We never found out what they were after, but we were just glad to be safe. Last week, I was woken up by a strange noise. It was late, probably around 2 a.m. At first, I thought it was just the wind or something outside, but then I heard it again. It sounded like someone trying to open a window. My heart started to race. I got out of bed as quietly as I could. My daughter, Lily, was asleep in her room down the hall. I crept to her door and peeked in. She was still sleeping peacefully. I didn't want to scare her, but I had to make sure she was safe. I went back to my room and grabbed my phone. I called 911 and whispered to the operator that someone was trying to break into my house. She told me to stay on the line and that help was on the way. I felt a little better knowing the police were coming, but I knew I had to protect Lily until they got here. I went back to Lily's room and gently shook her awake. She was groggy and confused, but I told her we needed to hide. I led her to the closet and told her to stay quiet, no matter what. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Just as I closed the closet door, I heard a loud crash from downstairs. The intruder had broken a window and was inside. My hands were shaking as I tried to think of what to do next. I didn't have any weapons, just a phone and a will to protect my child. I could hear footsteps moving through the house. They were getting closer. I hid behind the bedroom door, hoping he wouldn't come in. The footsteps paused outside the door, and my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. The door slowly creaked open. I held my breath, clutching the phone in my hand. The intruder stepped into the room. I could see his shadow in the dim light. He was looking around, probably searching for valuables. He moved towards the dresser, giving me a chance to slip out of the room. I tiptoed down the hall and into the bathroom. I needed to find something to defend myself with. I opened the cabinet and found a pair of scissors. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I could hear the intruder rummaging through my things. I prayed he wouldn't find Lily. I crept back towards the bedroom, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The floor creaked under my weight, and I froze. The footsteps stopped. I could hear my own breathing, loud and shaky. I peeked around the corner and saw the intruder standing still, listening. I held my breath, willing him to move on. After what felt like an eternity, he continued searching. I moved closer, scissors in hand. I knew I had to be ready to protect Lily if he found her. I positioned myself near the closet, ready to jump out if needed. The intruder was pulling out drawers, tossing things aside. He hadn't noticed the closet yet. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from downstairs. The intruder froze, and I heard a voice shout, "Police! Come out with your hands up!" Relief washed over me, but I knew it wasn't over yet. The intruder panicked and ran towards the door. I stepped out and swung the scissors, aiming for his arm. I managed to cut him, and he cried out in pain. He turned and shoved me hard, knocking me to the ground. He bolted out of the room and down the stairs. I heard the police shouting and the sound of a struggle. I got up and opened the closet door. Lily was huddled in the corner, tears streaming down her face. I hugged her tight, whispering that it was going to be okay. The police came up a few minutes later. They had the intruder in handcuffs. One of the officers stayed with us while the others searched the house. They found the broken window and the mess the intruder had made. The officer took our statements and assured us that the intruder wouldn't be coming back. They said he was a known criminal and would be going to jail for a long time. I felt a sense of relief, but I was still shaken. Lily and I stayed with my sister for the rest of the night. I couldn't bear the thought of going back to the house so soon. Last night was a shift like no other. I work as a security guard in a big office building downtown. Usually, it's pretty quiet. I make my rounds, check the cameras, and make sure everything is locked up. But last night, something happened that I still can't shake. It was around 1 a.m. when I got a call on the building's emergency line. It's a direct line, meant for real emergencies only. I answered it right away. A woman's voice was on the other end, trembling and scared. She said she was being held against her will somewhere in the building. I asked her where she was, trying to stay calm. She said she didn't know exactly, but described a room with no windows and a heavy door. My mind raced. I knew the building inside and out, and I couldn't think of a room like that. I told her to stay quiet and that I would find her. I grabbed my flashlight and set out to check every floor. I started on the ground floor and worked my way up. Each floor was empty, just dark offices and locked doors. I kept the phone on me, hoping she'd call back with more information. As I reached the top floor, I felt a chill. The top floor was supposed to be empty. No businesses, no offices, just storage. But the woman's voice was so real, so desperate. I checked every storage room, but they were all empty. I went back to the security office to check the cameras. I rewound the footage, looking for anything unusual. That's when I saw something strange. On one of the cameras, I saw a shadow moving in a hallway on the top floor. It was quick, but definitely there. I headed back up, heart pounding. I checked the hallway where I saw the shadow, but there was nothing. No signs of anyone. I started to think I was imagining things. But then, I heard a faint noise, like a door creaking. I followed the sound to a wall at the end of the hallway. It looked like a regular wall, but when I pressed on it, it moved. A hidden door. I couldn't believe it. I pushed it open and found a dark staircase leading down. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs. At the bottom was a heavy metal door, just like the woman described. I knocked softly and called out to her. She answered right away, her voice full of relief. I told her to stand back and tried the handle. It was locked. I looked around and saw a keypad on the wall. I had no idea what the code could be. I asked her if she knew, but she said her captors always punched it in too fast for her to see. I had to think fast. I remembered seeing a keypad in the security office, with a list of default codes for emergency use. I told her I'd be right back and ran up the stairs. My legs felt like lead as I sprinted to the office. I found the list and ran back down. I tried the first code, nothing. The second, still nothing. On the third try, the door clicked open. I pushed it open and saw her, tied to a chair in the middle of the room. She looked terrified, but unarmed. I rushed to her and untied her. She thanked me over and over, tears streaming down her face. I told her we needed to get out of there before her captors came back. We hurried up the stairs and out into the hallway. Just as we reached the main hallway, I heard voices. The captors were coming back. I led her to a nearby office and we hid inside, holding our breath. The voices got closer, then stopped right outside the door. I could see shadows moving under the door. They were looking for her. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. But after a few tense minutes, they moved on. We waited a bit longer, then made our way out. We got to the ground floor and out the front door. I called the police as soon as we were outside. They arrived quickly and took the woman to safety. They searched the building but didn't find the captors. They had vanished. The police questioned me for hours. I told them everything I knew, but there were still so many questions. Who were these people? Why was she being held? And how did they know the building so well? I didn't get any answers that night. I went home, exhausted and shaken. I couldn't sleep, replaying everything in my mind. The woman's voice, the hidden door, the shadows under the door. It all felt like a nightmare. Today, I'm still trying to process it all. The building feels different now, less safe. I keep thinking about that woman and what she went through. I'm just glad I was there to help, even if I don't have all the answers. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe again, but I do know one thing: I'll always trust my instincts. If I hadn't listened to that call, who knows what might have happened to her. It was late, around midnight, and I was driving home from a friend's house. The highway was empty and dark, just a long stretch of road with no other cars in sight. I was tired but focused on getting home. Then, I saw it. An abandoned car on the side of the road, hazard lights blinking. I slowed down and pulled over, curious but cautious. The car looked old, beaten up. Its driver's side door was open. I got out of my car, the night air cold against my skin. I walked up to the car, peering inside. No one was there. The front seat was empty, but I noticed something odd. The keys were still in the ignition. I was about to walk back to my car when I heard it, a faint thumping noise, like someone banging on metal. It was coming from the trunk. My heart started to race. I hesitated, unsure what to do. I looked around, the darkness pressing in on me. No signs of anyone else. Taking a deep breath, I walked to the back of the car. The thumping got louder. I found the trunk release lever inside the car and pulled it. The trunk popped open with a creak. Inside was a man, his hands and feet tied with rope, his mouth gagged. His eyes were wide with fear. I quickly removed the gag, and he gasped for air. "Help me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I was kidnapped. Please, untie me." My mind was racing. I looked around again, worried the kidnappers might still be nearby. I didn't know if I should untie him or run for help. But his eyes pleaded with me, and I couldn't leave him there. I started to untie the ropes, my hands shaking. "Who did this to you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know," he said, wincing as the ropes loosened. "They grabbed me from a parking lot, threw me in the trunk. I think they went to get something and left me here." I freed his hands and feet, and he climbed out of the trunk, rubbing his wrists where the ropes had been tight. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. "We need to get out of here before they come back." I nodded, my fear growing. We hurried to my car, glancing around for any sign of the kidnappers. As we got in, I heard a distant engine. Headlights appeared on the horizon, moving fast. Panic surged through me. "Get down," I told the man, and he ducked into the back seat. I started the car and sped off, my heart pounding in my chest. The other car got closer, its headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. I pushed the gas pedal harder, praying they wouldn't catch up. The man in the back seat kept looking behind us. "Faster," he urged. "They can't catch us." I took a sharp turn onto a side road, hoping to lose them. The road was bumpy and narrow, branches scraping against the car. The headlights faded behind us. I kept driving, not daring to slow down. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a small town. I pulled into a gas station, breathing hard. The man and I got out, looking around to make sure we weren't followed. The place was quiet, almost deserted. "We need to call the police," I said, my voice shaky. The man nodded. "Yes, but we need to be careful. They might be looking for us." We went inside the gas station. The clerk gave us a strange look but didn't say anything. I used the payphone to call the police, explaining what happened as clearly as I could. They said they'd send someone right away. We waited outside, the minutes ticking by slowly. The man was still on edge, glancing around nervously. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing with what could have happened if I hadn't stopped. Finally, a police car pulled up. 2 officers got out and approached us. I told them everything, from finding the car to freeing the man from the trunk. They took our statements and said they'd search the area for the kidnappers. They offered to take us to the station for safety. The man and I agreed, relieved to be with the police. As we drove away, I looked back at the dark road, thankful that we had escaped. At the station, they questioned us more, trying to piece together what happened. The man didn't know much about his kidnappers, just that they wore masks and didn't say much. The police promised to investigate and keep us updated. I left the station as dawn was breaking, exhausted but relieved. The man thanked me again before we parted ways. I drove home, the sun rising in the sky, grateful to be safe. I was driving cross-country to visit some old friends. After a long day on the road, I decided to stop in a small town for the night. It was one of those places that time seemed to forget, with just a few buildings and a single main street. I found a cheap motel and checked in, my body aching from the drive. After dropping my bags in the room, I headed to the only bar in town. I figured a drink would help me unwind before getting some sleep. The bar was small and dimly lit, with a few locals nursing their drinks. I sat at the far end, ordered a beer, and tried to blend in. A group of 4 men sat at a table near the middle, talking in hushed tones. I didn't pay them much attention at first, but then their conversation caught my ear. They were discussing something serious, their voices tense. I strained to hear without looking obvious. One of them mentioned a robbery that happened the previous night. They talked about how easy it was to break into the house and how they got away with a lot of money. My heart started pounding. These guys were criminals, and I was sitting just a few feet away from them. I kept my head down, trying to act natural, but I couldn't help but listen. They discussed splitting the money and what they would do if anyone found out. One of them, a tall guy with a beard, looked around the bar suspiciously. His eyes landed on me for a moment, and I quickly looked away, pretending to be engrossed in my drink. My mind raced. I needed to get out of there without drawing attention to myself. I waited for a moment when they seemed distracted and quietly stood up. I walked to the bathroom, trying to act casual. Once inside, I splashed some water on my face, trying to calm down. I knew I had to leave the bar and the town as quickly as possible. I waited in the bathroom for a few minutes, hoping they wouldn't notice my absence. When I thought it was safe, I slowly opened the door and peeked out. The men were still at their table, deep in conversation. I took a deep breath and headed for the exit. As I walked past their table, one of them looked up and saw me. "Hey, you," he called out. I froze, my heart racing. "You hear something you shouldn't have?" I shook my head, trying to play dumb. "Just passing through," I said, my voice shaky. "Didn't hear anything." The tall guy with the beard stood up, his eyes narrowing. "I don't believe you," he said, stepping closer. "Why don't you sit down for a bit?" I knew I was in trouble. I glanced around the bar, but the other patrons were minding their own business. I had to think fast. "I really need to get going," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Long drive ahead." He grabbed my arm, his grip tight. I said, "Sit down," he growled. The other men stood up too, closing in on me. Panic set in. I had to get out of there. Without thinking, I yanked my arm free and bolted for the door. I heard them shout and the sound of chairs scraping against the floor as they chased after me. I burst through the door and ran into the night, my heart pounding in my ears. The town was dark and quiet, the only light coming from a few street lamps. I sprinted down the main street, not looking back. I could hear their footsteps behind me, getting closer. I turned down an alley, hoping to lose them in the maze of buildings. I ducked behind a dumpster, trying to catch my breath. The footsteps grew louder, and I heard their angry voices calling out to each other. I stayed as still as possible, praying they wouldn't find me. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started to fade. I waited a few more minutes, then cautiously peeked out. The street was empty. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get back to my car and get out of town. I crept out of the alley, keeping to the shadows. My car was parked outside the motel, a few blocks away. I moved quickly, glancing around nervously. When I reached the motel, I saw the men near my car, searching the area. My heart sank. They were waiting for me. I needed a distraction. I picked up a rock and threw it down the street, hitting a metal trash can. The noise echoed through the night, and the men looked up, running toward the sound. I took my chance and sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys. I got in and started the engine, my hands shaking. The men realized what was happening and started running back toward me, shouting. I slammed on the gas and sped away, not looking back. As I drove out of town, my heart slowly began to calm down. I kept driving until I reached the next town, not stopping until I was sure I was far away from those men. I found another motel and checked in, locking the door behind me. I lay in bed, my mind racing. I couldn't believe what had happened. I was just lucky to have escaped. I knew I had to report what I overheard to the police, but for now, I was just grateful to be safe. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it again. The noise from the apartment above mine. It sounded like muffled cries and furniture being dragged. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or the neighbors moving things around, but it happened almost every night. I couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to investigate. I put on my robe and slippers and stepped into the hallway. It was quiet, almost eerily so. I crept upstairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. The noises grew louder as I approached the apartment above mine. My heart was pounding in my chest. I reached the door and listened. It was definitely someone crying, a woman's voice. I knew my landlord, Mr. Jenkins, lived here. He was always friendly, but something felt off. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. The crying stopped suddenly, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't want to leave without knowing what was going on. I went back to my apartment and grabbed a bobby pin from my drawer. I had seen enough movies to know how to pick a lock, or at least I hoped I did. I returned to the door and started fiddling with the lock. After a few tense minutes, it clicked open. I pushed the door open slowly and peeked inside. The apartment was dark, but I could see a light coming from under a door at the end of the hallway. I tiptoed inside, my hands shaking. As I got closer to the door, I heard the crying again, mixed with soft whimpers. I opened the door and saw my neighbor, Sarah, tied to a chair. Her face was bruised, and she looked terrified. She saw me and her eyes widened with hope. I rushed to her side and started untying the ropes. "We need to get out of here," I whispered. She nodded, too scared to speak. Just as I freed her hands, I heard the front door open. My blood ran cold. Mr. Jenkins was back. We had to hide. I helped Sarah up, and we slipped into a closet just as Mr. Jenkins walked into the room. He looked around, suspicious. "I know someone's here," he said in a low voice. Sarah clung to me, her breath shaky. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find us. Mr. Jenkins started searching the room, opening drawers and looking under the bed. He was getting closer to the closet. I felt like my heart would explode. He reached for the closet door, and I braced myself. Just then, his phone rang. He stopped and answered it, stepping out of the room. I took the opportunity and whispered to Sarah, "We need to move, now." We slipped out of the closet and crept toward the front door. Mr. Jenkins was still on the phone, his back to us. We made it to the door, and I carefully opened it. It creaked, and Mr. Jenkins turned around, his eyes narrowing. "Hey," he shouted, but we were already running down the stairs. We burst out of the building and ran down the street. I didn't stop until we reached a busy area. We found a payphone, and I called the police. Sarah was shaking, but she managed to tell them what happened. They said they were on their way. We waited, hiding in the shadows. I kept looking around, terrified that Mr. Jenkins would find us. Finally, the police arrived. They took Sarah's statement and went to the building to arrest Mr. Jenkins. I felt a mix of relief and fear. What if he had accomplices? What if he got away? The police assured us they would handle it. They took Sarah to the hospital and offered me a ride home. I declined, too scared to go back. Instead, I stayed with a friend for a few nights until I felt safe again. It turned out Mr. Jenkins had been holding Sarah captive for weeks. He had a history of violence, but no one suspected him. I was just glad I could help her, even though the experience left me shaken. I moved out of the building a month later. I couldn't stay there after what happened. Every noise, every creak reminded me of that night. I found a new place, far away, and tried to move on. But the memory of Sarah's terrified face and the sound of Mr. Jenkins' voice still haunt me. I noticed a man early in the morning, dressed in a utility worker uniform, inspecting the houses on my street. He wore a hard hat and had a tool belt slung around his waist. He seemed to be checking the meters or something. I didn't think much of it at first. Utility workers come by often enough. It wasn't until he lingered in front of my house longer than usual that I got suspicious. He kept glancing around nervously, which put me on edge. I decided to watch him for a bit from my window, just to be sure everything was all right. He moved to my front door and took out a small device, pretending to skin something. I felt a pit in my stomach. I knew something wasn't right. I kept watching, my heart pounding. He then walked around to the side of my house, out of my line of sight. I quickly moved to another window to keep an eye on him. That's when I saw him trying to open one of the windows. He was no utility worker. This was a burglar, plain and simple. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. My police training kicked in. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering the situation to the dispatcher. I didn't want to alert the burglar that I was onto him. I then went to my closet and pulled out my old service weapon. I hadn't used it in years, but I kept it clean and ready, just in case. I crept down the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. I could hear the man now, jiggling the window lock, muttering to himself. I positioned myself near the back door, my gun in hand. I knew I had to confront him, but I didn't want to shoot unless I absolutely had to. The window finally gave way, and I heard him climbing inside. I took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway, my gun aimed at him. "Stop right there," I shouted. The man froze, his eyes wide with shock. He didn't expect anyone to be home, let alone armed. "Get down on the ground, hands behind your head," I ordered. He hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered himself to the floor. I kept my gun trained on him, my heart racing. I didn't know if he was armed, but I couldn't take any chances. I moved closer, still keeping my distance. "Why are you breaking into my house?" I demanded. He didn't answer, just stared at me with a mix of fear and anger. I could hear sirens in the distance, getting closer. Relief washed over me. The police arrived within minutes, bursting through the front door. I kept my gun pointed at the man until the officers took over, cuffing him and hauling him to his feet. I finally lowered my weapon, my hands shaking. One of the officers, a young woman, came over to me. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked. I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "I'm fine, just a bit shaken up," I replied. She took my statement while her colleagues searched the man and the rest of the house. They found burglary tools in his pockets and a knife. I shuddered at the thought of what could have happened if I hadn't been prepared. The officers led the man out to their patrol car, and I watched from the doorway, still in disbelief. After they left, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking everything. I sat down in the living room, trying to calm myself. It was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Someone had tried to invade my home, my sanctuary. I called my wife, who was out of town visiting family. I told her what happened, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the fear in my voice. She was shocked and worried, but I assured her I was okay. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump, every creak of the house set my heart racing. I kept my gun close, just in case. The image of the man's face, his wide eyes staring at me, was burned into my mind. In the days that followed, I installed a security system, complete with cameras and alarms. I needed to feel safe again, needed to know that my home was protected. The police kept me updated on the case. The man was a known burglar, wanted for several break-ins in the area. It took a while, but I eventually started to feel normal again. I went back to my routine, though I was always more cautious, always more aware of my surroundings. The experience had changed me, made me realize how vulnerable we all are. I was grateful for my training, for the skills that allowed me to protect my home. But more than that, I was grateful that it ended without anyone getting hurt. It was a terrifying reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, but also of the strength we find in ourselves when we need it most. I rented a cabin by a lake to work on my novel. The place was quiet, perfect for writing. It was old, but cozy. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, and the trees around it rustled softly in the breeze. I thought it was just what I needed to get away from the noise of the city. On the second day, I noticed something odd about the cabin. There was a section of the floor in the living room that sounded hollow when I walked over it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I moved the rug and saw a trapdoor. It took some effort to pry it open, but I managed. Below was a small, dark room. I used my phone's flashlight to look around. There were old, dusty boxes and a table with a few papers scattered on it. I climbed down and started going through the boxes. Most of them had old clothes and books, but one had photos. They were of a man tied to a chair, bruised and bleeding. My heart started pounding. This wasn't what I expected to find. I went through the papers on the table. They were notes about the man in the photos. They talked about debts and warnings, and how he wouldn't listen. It was clear he had been tortured. I felt sick to my stomach. I wanted to leave, but I heard a noise from above. Someone was in the cabin. I froze, listening. Footsteps moved across the floor, then stopped. I heard voices. They were talking about coming back to check on the place, making sure no one found anything. Panic set in. I had to get out of there, but I couldn't go up now. They would see me. I stayed as quiet as possible, hoping they wouldn't come down. They moved around, checking rooms, talking about the last time they were there. One of them mentioned the guy in the photos. My heart sank. They were the ones who did this. I had to think fast. I saw a small window near the ceiling of the hidden room. It was a tight squeeze, but I could fit. I carefully climbed up and pushed it open, trying not to make any noise. I squeezed through and fell into the bushes outside. I heard one of the men coming closer, so I stayed low and crawled away from the cabin. Once I was far enough, I got up and ran. I didn't know where to go, just away. The woods were thick, and I stumbled a few times, but I kept going. I found a spot to hide and catch my breath. My mind was racing. I needed to get help, but my phone was still in the cabin. I decided to head towards the nearest town. It was a few miles away, but I didn't have a choice. I kept off the main paths, sticking to the trees. I didn't want them to find me. Every noise made me jump. I was scared they were following me. It started getting dark, and I was still in the woods. I found a large tree and hid behind it, trying to stay calm. I waited for a while, listening for any signs of them. It was quiet, but I didn't feel safe. I needed to keep moving. I finally saw lights in the distance. It was the town. Relief washed over me, but I couldn't relax yet. I hurried towards the lights, trying to stay hidden. I reached the edge of the town and saw a gas station. I went inside and asked the clerk to call the police. The police arrived quickly. I told them everything, from the hidden room to the men in the cabin. They took me seriously and sent officers to check it out. They found the cabin and the room, but the men were gone. They said I did the right thing by running. They took me to the station to get my statement. It was late, and I was exhausted, but I was safe. They promised to investigate and keep me updated. I was just glad to be away from that cabin. A few days later, they called. They found the men. They had a history of crime, including the kidnapping and torture of the man in the photos. They were arrested, and I felt a sense of relief knowing they were caught. I went back to the city, deciding I had enough of cabins and lakes for a while. It was a terrifying experience, but I was glad I got out alive. I'm more cautious now, but I still love writing. I just do it from the safety of my apartment. I decided to take a shortcut through the forest to get to a party. It was late, and I wanted to save time. The path was dark, with only the moonlight filtering through the trees. It seemed like a good idea at the time. As I walked, I heard strange noises coming from deeper in the forest. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just animals. But then I saw a flickering light ahead, like a campfire. Curiosity got the better of me, so I went closer. When I reached the clearing, I froze. There were a group of men digging a hole. They had flashlights and shovels, and they were working quickly. My heart started to race. I was about to turn back when I saw what they were burying. It was a body wrapped in a sheet. Panic set in. I stepped back slowly, trying not to make a sound. I didn't want them to see me. But just as I turned to leave, one of the men looked up. He saw me and shouted to the others. I knew I had to run. I sprinted back towards the path I came from, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear the men yelling and crashing through the trees behind me. They were coming after me. My mind raced as I tried to remember the way. The forest was dense, and I stumbled over roots and rocks. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the sounds getting closer. I had to find a way out. I saw a small hill and decided to climb it, hoping I could see where I was going from the top. I made it to the top, breathless and panicked. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. In the distance, I saw lights. It had to be the road or a house. I started heading towards them, hoping I wasn't too far from safety. The men were still chasing me. Their voices grew louder, and I could hear them getting closer. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the pain in my legs. I reached the edge of the forest and saw the road below. I was almost there. I ran down the hill and reached the road. I flagged down the first car I saw, nearly jumping into the street. The driver slammed on the brakes, looking startled. I told him what happened, and he quickly called the police. While waiting for the police, I stayed as far from the forest as I could. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't stop shaking. I watched the forest, afraid the men would come out after me. The police arrived shortly after. I gave them all the details I could remember. They went into the forest to investigate, and I stayed at the edge, too scared to go back in. They searched for a while, but the men were gone. The police found the body and some of the equipment the men used. They told me it was a known crime scene. The men were part of a group involved in several criminal activities. I was relieved they were caught, but the whole experience left me shaken. I went to the party eventually, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting someone to be following me. I told a few people about what happened, but they didn't seem to understand the gravity of it. The police kept me updated. They arrested the men and recovered more evidence. It was all over the news. I tried to go back to my normal life, but the fear stayed with me. I avoided the forest and took the long way around whenever I could. The whole thing made me realize how dangerous it can be to take shortcuts. It's not just about saving time. I learned that sometimes it's better to stick to the known paths, no matter how tempting it is to stray from them. I was working late into the night, trying to meet a deadline for a big project. My apartment was quiet, save for the soft hum of my computer. It was just past midnight when I heard a loud banging coming from the apartment next door. I tried to ignore it, but it kept going. The noise was constant and rhythmic, like something heavy being dropped repeatedly. It was driving me crazy. I got up and knocked on the door of the neighboring apartment. No one answered. I knocked harder, and still nothing. I decided to call the landlord. I explained the situation, but he told me he couldn't do anything until the morning. That didn't help me at all. The banging continued, and it felt like it was getting louder. After another hour of the relentless noise, I called the landlord again. He said the same thing. I was getting really frustrated and worried. I started to think something might be wrong. I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I went back to my apartment and tried to work, but the noise was too distracting. I couldn't focus. I decided I needed to check it out myself. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the door. When I reached the neighboring apartment, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I hesitated but then pushed it open a bit. The noise was even louder now. I stepped inside, trying to be as quiet as possible. The apartment was dark except for the light coming from under the door to the back room. I could hear movement and muffled voices. My heart was pounding in my chest. I carefully approached the door and peeked through the crack. Inside, I saw a man and a woman. They were moving around a room filled with boxes and bags. They were packing things quickly. There were strange objects and what looked like bags of something. It was clear they were up to something illegal. I didn't want to confront them directly. I slipped back out of the apartment and went back to mine. I called the landlord again, demanding immediate action. He finally said he would send someone over, but it would still be a while. I felt trapped. The noise had stopped, but I didn't want to stay in my apartment with those people next door. I decided to call the police. I explained everything and said I was worried about my safety. They promised to send an officer as soon as possible. While waiting, I kept an eye on the hallway. I was afraid they might come out and find me. I could hear them moving around, talking in low voices. I stayed hidden, making sure not to make a sound. The minutes felt like hours. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens approaching. Relief washed over me. I heard the police knock on the neighbor's door and then enter. I stayed hidden, waiting for them to come back out. When the police came out, they said they had found evidence of drug dealing and other illegal activities. The man and woman were taken into custody. I was shaken but relieved that it was over. The landlord finally showed up to check the apartment. He apologized for the delay and said he would make sure the apartment was cleaned up and secured. I thanked him but was still on edge. The police gave me a statement to fill out, asking for details about what I saw and heard. I did my best to provide accurate information. They assured me that they would keep an eye on the situation and make sure it was safe. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the events in my mind, worrying about what might have happened if I hadn't called for help. The whole experience left me anxious and shaken. The next day, I was able to get back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I kept checking to make sure everything was secure and that there were no more disturbances. It took a while for me to feel comfortable in my apartment again. I made sure to keep an eye on my surroundings and stayed alert. The incident made me realize how important it is to trust your instincts and act quickly in dangerous situations. The whole thing was a terrifying experience, but I was grateful that I got out of it safely. I pulled into the fuel station on the outskirts of town around 11 p.m. It was one of those places that felt a little too isolated, even though it was the only one for miles. The neon sign flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow. I needed gas and hoped I could get in and out quickly. The place was empty, which wasn't surprising given the hour. I parked at the pump, and as I got out, I noticed the clerk inside the small booth. He was staring right at me. I tried to ignore it and focused on filling my tank. The clerk was an older man with a graying beard and glasses that seemed a bit too big for his face. He finally came outside when I was halfway done. He walked over with a kind of shuffle, his eyes fixed on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Evening," he said, his voice strangely cheery for such a late hour. "Evening," I replied, trying to be polite while keeping my distance. He started talking about the weather, the lack of business, and how he wished it was busier. I gave short responses, trying to get the transaction over with. He seemed to take my disinterest as an invitation to keep talking. I went inside to pay, and he followed me, still chatting. There was an uncomfortable energy in the small, dimly lit shop. I glanced around, noticing that the place was not as well kept as one would expect. There were old newspapers piled up and empty coffee cups scattered around. As I waited for the transaction to process, I noticed the clerk's eyes darting to the back of the store, where there was a door marked "Employees Only." My gut told me something was wrong. He kept talking about random topics, almost as if he was trying to distract me. His questions grew more personal, asking about where I was headed and if I was traveling alone. I tried to steer the conversation back to business, but he didn't seem to get the hint. When I finally paid and headed for the door, he followed me outside. He stood close, making casual small talk, but his demeanor was unnerving. I tried to brush him off, but he kept lingering. I finished pumping my gas, and that's when I noticed something odd. The door to the back room of the store was slightly ajar. From where I stood, I could see a large, black duffel bag in plain view. It was too big to be a regular piece of luggage. I told myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. As I started to drive away, I saw the clerk watching me from the window. His gaze was unsettling, almost like he was assessing me. I drove for a few miles, trying to calm my nerves. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a car following me. I turned on my radio to distract myself, but I couldn't stop thinking about the clerk and the duffel bag. I decided to take a different route home, avoiding any main roads. I drove through winding back roads, hoping to shake off any potential followers. My heart raced with every turn, and I couldn't help but feel paranoid. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a well-lit diner. I parked my car and went inside to regroup. I ordered coffee and tried to steady my nerves. I was still on edge, feeling like someone might be watching me. While I sat there, I decided to call the local police. I gave them a brief description of the fuel station and the clerk's behavior. I mentioned the duffel bag and my concern. They seemed to take my call seriously and promised to look into it. I stayed at the diner for a while longer, waiting to feel safe before heading home. As the sun started to rise, I finally felt like it was okay to leave. I took the long way home, making sure no one was tailing me. When I got home, I was exhausted and still shaken. I watched the news the next morning and saw a brief report about a local police investigation into a suspicious fuel station. They didn't give many details, but it was enough to make me feel a bit better. The incident left me anxious for a while. Last weekend, Chris and I decided to get away from the city and rented a small vacation cabin in the woods. It was supposed to be a relaxing time. The cabin was quaint, nestled in a quiet area, far from the nearest town. We were looking forward to a peaceful few days. We arrived late on Friday evening, just as the sun was setting. The cabin was just as charming as the photos had promised. We settled in, made dinner, and then decided to turn in early. The solitude was exactly what we needed. Around midnight, I was just starting to drift off when I heard a faint noise. It was a sort of scratching sound, followed by what seemed like faint footsteps. I assumed it was an animal and tried to ignore it, but it wouldn't stop. Chris was already asleep, so I decided to check it out myself. I tiptoed through the darkened cabin, trying to pinpoint the noise. It sounded like it was coming from the front door. I carefully peeked out the living room window but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The scratching sound had stopped, so I went back to bed, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. I just couldn't get comfortable, though. Every little noise seemed amplified in the silence of the night. A few hours later, I was jolted awake by a louder, more insistent noise. It was definitely coming from the front of the cabin. I gently shook Chris awake. "Chris, wake up. I think someone's trying to get in." He groaned and rubbed his eyes. "What? Are you sure?" "Pretty sure," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We both got up and crept to the living room. The scratching had stopped, but now we could hear faint clanging noises, like metal against metal. Chris peeked through the peephole on the door but saw nothing. He turned to me, looking worried. Should we call the police? Before we could decide, the clanging noise started again. Chris picked up his phone to dial 911, but before he could get through, the noise stopped abruptly. The silence was even more unnerving. We waited a few minutes, listening for any sounds. Suddenly, there was a loud click. The front door was unlocked. Someone had a key. Panic set in as we realized the intruder was already inside. Chris and I moved quickly. We quietly locked all the doors and windows and pulled the curtain shut. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. We needed to figure out a plan to get help without drawing attention. Chris suggested we try to leave through a window. We quietly opened one in the bedroom and peered outside. The area was dark, but we didn't see anyone. The thought of sneaking out made me nervous, but it seemed like our best option. As we were about to climb out, We heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone was moving around the cabin. I pulled Chris back inside, and we retreated to the back room, which had a small window facing the woods. I whispered, "We need to stay quiet. Maybe we can find a way to get the police here without them noticing." Chris nodded, and we huddled by the window. He sent a text to 911, explaining our situation and location. We hoped they would receive it and send help quickly. The footsteps grew louder and closer. We could hear muffled voices now. It sounded like more than one person. The tension was unbearable as we tried to stay as silent as possible. The door to the back room creaked open. My heart raced. Chris and I held our breath, trying to remain still. I peeked around the corner and saw a shadow move past the door. Whoever was in the cabin was searching for us. We waited, barely moving, as the footsteps continued. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The intruders seemed to be getting further away. I hoped that meant they were leaving. Just then, we heard the distant sound of sirens. Relief washed over me. I hoped the police had arrived before the intruders found us. We listened carefully, and the footsteps grew quieter. After what felt like an eternity, we heard the police knocking on the front door. Chris and I exchanged glances. It was time to make ourselves known. We cautiously moved toward the front of the cabin and opened the door. The police were there, and they quickly assessed the situation. They searched the cabin and found no one inside. The officers took our statements and assured us they would investigate the incident. We were finally able to relax. The police said they would patrol the area and keep an eye out for any suspicious activity. They also advised us to stay alert and secure the cabin if we decided to stay. We decided to cut our trip short and head back home. I was working late at the office last Tuesday, trying to finish up a report that was due the next morning. The place was quiet. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional clack of my keyboard. I had been alone for hours when I heard a knock at the office door. It was strange because I wasn't expecting anyone. I went to the door and saw a maintenance technician standing outside. He was in uniform, but he didn't have a company name on his clothes, which struck me as odd. He said he needed to do some work on the building's air conditioning system. I was a little wary since it was late, but I figured maybe the work was urgent. I let him in and showed him to the utility room where the air conditioning unit was. He seemed a bit too eager to get started. He was fidgety and kept glancing around. I shrugged it off at first, thinking he was just anxious about the job. I went back to my desk to finish my work. Every now and then, I hear noises from the utility room, like banging and scraping. I couldn't see him from my desk, but I could hear him moving around. It was unsettling, but I tried to ignore it and focus on my report. After about 30 minutes, I noticed the noise had stopped. I went to check on him and found him standing by the utility room door, looking like he was just waiting. His behavior was strange. He wasn't working on the equipment, and he wasn't using any tools. He just stood there, his hands by his sides. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just making sure everything is running smoothly," he replied, but his voice sounded odd. There was something off about the way he looked at me, like he was sizing me up. I tried to get back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The technician's behavior was starting to creep me out. I went to the utility room again to see what he was doing. He was fiddling with the air conditioning unit, but it didn't look like he was making any progress. "Do you need any help?" I asked, trying to sound casual. No, just fine," he said quickly. He gave me a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. I went back to my desk, but now I was feeling genuinely uneasy. I tried to call the building manager to ask if there was any scheduled maintenance, but the call went straight to voicemail. I decided to keep an eye on the technician through the glass window in the door. As the minutes went by, his behavior became even more unsettling. He kept walking to the door and looking out into the hallway, like he was expecting someone. He would then turn back to the unit and pretend to work. I started to get really nervous. I didn't want to confront him directly, but I also didn't want to be alone with him in case something was wrong. I decided to try calling 911, but I couldn't do it openly. I waited until the technician was back at the unit and used my phone discreetly to dial. The dispatcher answered, and I tried to explain the situation without being too obvious. I told them I was alone with an unknown maintenance worker who was acting strangely. The technician suddenly came into the office, startling me. He asked if I had a problem with the air conditioning, but I could tell he was trying to see if I was talking to someone. I told him everything was fine and that I was waiting for the building manager to call me back. He seemed to accept this and went back to the utility room. I watched him through the glass again, and that's when I noticed he had removed the cover of the unit. It wasn't clear what he was doing, but it looked suspicious. I was afraid he might be tampering with something. I kept waiting for the police to arrive, trying to stay calm and not make any sudden movements. The technician seemed to become more agitated as time passed. He would occasionally glance at the door and then back to the unit, as if he was growing more impatient. Finally, I heard sirens outside. The technician must have heard them too because he suddenly became very tense. He quickly tried to gather his tools and pack up. I didn't wait for him to leave. I ran to the front door and unlocked it, hoping the police would get here quickly. When the police arrived, they went straight to the utility room. I stayed with them, explaining what had happened. They found the technician in the act of trying to disable the air conditioning unit, but he had stopped as soon as he saw the officers. The police arrested him and began questioning him about what he was doing. They also checked the security footage, which showed the technician entering the building without any valid reason or authorization. It turned out he had no affiliation with any maintenance company. He was simply a fraud who had targeted the building. The officers assured me that they had everything under control. They checked the office thoroughly to make sure nothing had been tampered with and took my statement. I was shaken but relieved that the situation had been resolved without any harm coming to me. After everything was settled, I decided to leave the office and head home. The thought of being alone there with someone who had such dangerous intentions made me feel uneasy. I was alone at the warehouse for my usual night shift. It was a big, empty place, and the silence was sometimes a bit eerie. I'd gotten used to working alone at night, but things started to get weird a few nights ago. A new security guard was assigned to patrol the area, and his behavior made me really uncomfortable. At first, he seemed okay, just doing his rounds like any other guard. But soon enough, I noticed something off about him. He would come by my area more often than necessary and linger a bit too long. It felt like he was staring at me more than checking the premises. I tried to shake it off, telling myself he was just doing his job. But then things got worse. One night, he walked in while I was working. He started asking personal questions about where I lived and what I did on my days off. It felt like he was prying into my private life. His questions seemed innocent enough, but the way he asked them made me uneasy. I was polite but vague in my answers, hoping he'd get the hint. Instead, he started showing up even more frequently. It was almost like he was trying to keep tabs on me. One evening, I caught him using his phone while walking around. I noticed he was pointing it towards my workspace. At first, I thought he might be taking pictures of the warehouse for security purposes, but it still didn't sit right with me. I decided to keep an eye on him and see if he was up to something more suspicious. Later that night, I went to the restroom and saw him standing outside, acting like he was on the phone. When I came out, he quickly hung up and walked away. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to hide something. I needed to find out what he was up to. I started doing some investigating. I looked around my workspace for any signs of tampering or hidden cameras. I found nothing at first, but I couldn't stop feeling like I was being watched. I decided to check the security room where he kept his gear. I knew it was a risk, but I had to do something. I managed to slip into the security room when he was out of sight. The room was filled with monitors and recording equipment. I didn't touch anything but looked around for any signs of hidden cameras. I found a few devices hidden in plain sight, disguised as everyday items. They were definitely not part of standard security equipment. The more I looked, the more I found. I realized he was spying on me through these hidden cameras. It was clear he was using them to watch me while I worked alone. I felt a surge of panic but tried to stay calm. I needed to come up with a plan to deal with this. I decided to go back to my workstation and act like everything was normal. I took a deep breath and focused on my tasks while thinking about what to do next. I knew I had to protect myself but didn't want to alert him that I knew what he was doing. I thought about calling the police but decided to wait until I had more evidence. I wasn't sure how he would react if he realized I was onto him. I needed to find a way to secure the evidence and get him caught without putting myself in immediate danger. I noticed he was getting more aggressive with his patrols. He was coming by my area more frequently and seemed more interested in what I was doing. It was clear he was getting more bold. I knew I had to act quickly. I decided to plant a fake camera in a visible spot, hoping it would make him think I was aware of his surveillance and that I had evidence. I took an old security camera I had from home, set it up where it was visible, and pretended to adjust it like I was monitoring him. When he saw the camera, he looked surprised but didn't say anything. He started acting even more strangely, trying to avoid coming too close to me. It was like he was scared of being caught. I used this opportunity to gather more evidence. I managed to take pictures of the hidden cameras and the surveillance equipment in the security room. Once I had enough proof, I finally called the police. I explained everything, including the security guard's behavior and the hidden cameras. The police arrived and went through the security room. They found the hidden cameras and took them as evidence. They also questioned the security guard, who tried to act innocent but quickly broke down under pressure. He was arrested for illegal surveillance and invasion of privacy. I was relieved but still shaken. The police assured me that they had everything under control and that I was safe. I recently checked into an old, dilapidated hotel for a review. I was excited to see what I'd find since it had a lot of history and was known for being one of the oldest in the area. The hotel was everything you'd expect from a place stuck in time. The lobby had a musty smell, and the walls were peeling. It felt like stepping back into the 1950s. When I arrived, the place seemed empty. The receptionist, an older woman with a stern look, greeted me with a cold nod. She handed me the key without saying much. I didn't think much of it. Some places are just like that, I figured. My room was on the top floor, at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The carpet was threadbare, and the lights flickered. I found my room and was struck by how dated it looked. The furniture was old, and the bed had a lumpy mattress. Still, I had work to do, so I settled in and started my review notes. Later that evening, I decided to explore the hotel a bit. The more I walked around, the stranger things felt. The hallways seemed to stretch longer than they should, and I started to notice the occasional odd sound, creaks and whispers that didn't seem to have a clear source. While walking through one of the back hallways, I saw a door slightly ajar. I could hear muffled voices coming from inside. Curiosity got the better of me, so I peeked in. There was no one in sight, but the room looked like an old storage closet filled with dusty furniture and boxes. The next day, things got even weirder. I tried to have breakfast in the hotel's dining area. The staff, including a young man who seemed particularly unfriendly, moved around without speaking much. They would glance at me from time to time, but whenever I tried to make eye contact, they looked away quickly. I asked the young man about the history of the hotel, hoping to get some background for my review. His response was curt and evasive. He said the hotel had been in the family for generations but didn't offer any details. That night, I started hearing noises again. This time, they were louder thumping sounds and what seemed like footsteps coming from the floor above me. I decided to investigate but couldn't find anything unusual. The next morning, I tried to check out early, but the receptionist was nowhere to be found. I waited for hours, but no one showed up. The young man from the dining area finally appeared, looking agitated. He said the receptionist had stepped out and would be back later. I decided to kill time by exploring the hotel's basement, which I hadn't seen yet. The basement was cold and damp. There were old maintenance tools and piles of junk. As I looked around, I noticed a small, hidden door behind some boxes. I managed to pry the door open and found a narrow stairway leading down to another level. The air was thick and musty, and I could barely see anything in the dim light of my flashlight. I went down the stairs cautiously. At the bottom, I discovered a series of small, locked rooms. I could hear faint cries and shuffling noises coming from inside. My heart pounded as I tried to open one of the doors. To my horror, I found one room with chains and old restraints attached to the walls. I quickly backed away, feeling a rush of panic. I needed to get out of there, but the stairway seemed to close in on me as I hurried back up. When I reached the basement, I saw the young man standing at the top of the stairs. His face was expressionless. He asked me what I was doing down there, and his tone was menacing. I told him I'd been exploring and was heading out. He didn't say anything but watched me closely as I made my way back to the main floor. As I approached the lobby, the receptionist finally appeared, looking annoyed. I tried to explain what I'd seen and wanted to leave immediately. She said there was no need to be alarmed and that the rooms were part of the hotel's old storage areas. She promised they were no longer in use. I wasn't convinced and pressed for more information, but she just gave me a blank stare. I decided to leave as quickly as I could. I packed my things and checked out, feeling like I was being watched the whole time. As I drove away from the hotel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened there. I reported what I'd seen to the authorities, but without concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. The hotel was soon closed for renovations, and I never went back. To this day, I wonder what really happened in that basement and why the staff was so secretive. I stayed late in the university lab that night, trying to finish up some research I had been working on for weeks. It was quiet and the only sound was the soft hum of the equipment. I was so focused that I didn't notice the time passing by. Around midnight, I heard the door creak open. I looked up to see someone standing in the doorway. It was Jason, a fellow student from one of my classes. I barely knew him, but I had seen him around campus. "Hey, Mia," he said, casually walking in. "Working late, huh?" I nodded, trying to be polite but not really in the mood for a chat. Yeah, just trying to get this done. Jason didn't leave. Instead, he moved closer and started looking over my shoulder at the data on my screen. I felt uncomfortable with how close he was. "What are you working on?" he asked. I tried to explain briefly, focusing on the research rather than the specifics. I didn't want to reveal too much. Jason kept asking detailed questions, almost pushing me to explain every step. His questions started feeling invasive, and his manner was strangely intense. He seemed genuinely interested, but something about the way he was probing made me uneasy. I gave short answers and tried to redirect the conversation, but he wouldn't let up. His eyes were focused on my screen, and he occasionally glanced at the stack of papers on my desk. As I answered another one of his questions, I noticed he was no longer just curious. His questions had shifted to more personal aspects of my research and the methods I used. It felt like he was trying to dig into areas that were confidential. "Have you had any problems with your experiments?" he asked, his tone growing more insistent. "Any unexpected results?" I sensed something was off. I had always been cautious about sharing detailed information about my work, especially since some of it was sensitive. "Nothing out of the ordinary," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Why do you ask?" Jason didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the lab, as if checking to see if anyone was nearby. "I've heard some things about your project," he said finally, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I just want to make sure you're not missing anything." His demeanor made me more nervous. I could tell he was not just a curious student, there was something more to his interest. I felt a growing sense of dread. I needed to protect my research and, more importantly, keep myself safe. I decided to act as though I was still engaged in the conversation but looked for an opportunity to get him out of the lab. "Actually, I think I need to finish this up. Can we talk another time?" I said, hoping he would take the hint. Jason didn't seem to take the hint. Instead, he sat down at one of the chairs and continued to ask questions, now about the security of my data. "How do you keep your files secure?" he asked, leaning closer. "Do you have backups?" I was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. "I have standard procedures for data security," I replied, trying to sound firm. "I really need to get this done now. Can you please leave?" He didn't move. Instead, he looked at me with a strange expression, almost as if he was assessing whether or not I was lying. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, and it made me shiver. Realizing that staying there any longer would only make things worse, I decided to take action. I reached for my phone and pretended to make a call. I said into the phone, "Hi, yes, this is Mia. I need some help in the lab." Jason's eyes widened slightly. He stood up abruptly. "Okay, I'll leave you to it," he said, his voice now strained. He quickly walked toward the door, but not before giving me one last look. It was clear he wasn't finished with me, but I needed him out of the lab. As soon as he was gone, I locked the door behind him and checked my research materials. Everything seemed to be in place, but I wasn't taking any chances. I backed up my data and made sure my files were secured. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stayed in the lab for a bit longer, making sure that no one else would come in. I was on high alert, knowing that Jason's behavior could mean trouble. The next day, I reported the incident to the campus security and my supervisor. They took the matter seriously and assured me they would look into it. I also made sure to change any passwords and security codes related to my research. Jason didn't show up in any of my classes after that, and I didn't hear from him again. The whole experience left me shaken, but I was relieved that I had managed to protect my work and myself. I was more cautious from then on, always being careful about who I spoke to about my research. It was a lesson learned the hard way about how important it is to stay vigilant, especially when dealing with people who seem too interested in what you're doing. I never thought much of it when the first gift appeared on my doorstep. It was a small, unmarked box with a simple ribbon. Inside was a pretty necklace, nothing expensive but definitely not something I would have bought for myself. At first, I thought it was a mistake or maybe a gift from a friend. When I received another gift the next week, I started to get a little uneasy. This time it was a bouquet of flowers, with a note that just said, "Thinking of you." No name, no indication of who sent it. I didn't recognize the handwriting. I didn't have a clue who it could be. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was some kind of prank. But then the gifts kept coming. One day it was a box of chocolates, the next it was a framed photo of a scenic place I had never visited. Each time, there was a note with a simple message, like "Hope you enjoy this" or "Have a nice day." I started to feel uncomfortable. The notes were getting more personal, mentioning things about my family and how they hoped we were all well. I hadn't told anyone about these gifts. I didn't want to alarm anyone without knowing who was behind this. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I noticed someone standing across the street. They were far enough away that I couldn't see their face clearly, but I could tell they were watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't recognize the person, and they quickly turned and walked away when I looked directly at them. My anxiety only grew after that. The gifts kept coming, and they seemed to be following a pattern. I decided to speak to my husband about it. He was concerned and suggested that we should contact the police. I agreed, but I wanted to wait and see if things escalated further. Then came the day when things took a darker turn. I found a package that was wrapped in brown paper, with a note that read, "I know where you live." Inside was a photo of our house, taken from the street. It wasn't a particularly good photo, but it was clear enough to show that the person had been close to our home. That evening, I saw the same figure standing across the street again. This time, I made sure to get a better look. It was a man, wearing a dark hoodie. He was clearly watching us. I told my husband, and he immediately decided to call the police. We were advised to document everything and be vigilant. The next few days were filled with tension. We had to be extra careful about our routines. We kept our doors locked and made sure all our windows were secure. Despite this, the gifts kept arriving, and the notes continued to be unsettling. They started mentioning our children's names and what their school schedules were. One night, after we had gone to bed, we heard a noise outside. My husband went to check, and he saw the same man lurking by our driveway. The man quickly ran off when he saw my husband approaching. We called the police again, and they promised to send someone out to investigate. The next morning, I found another gift on our doorstep. It was a small stuffed toy, the same kind that my daughter had lost weeks ago. The note said, "I know what you're missing." That was the last straw. I was terrified for my family's safety. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I set up a camera near our front door to capture any activity. I also started to keep a journal of every incident and note. I made sure to share all this information with the police and kept them updated. One evening, while reviewing the footage from the camera, I saw the man clearly. He was wearing the same dark hoodie, and he lingered around our house for several minutes before leaving a package. I immediately showed the footage to the police. They identified him as someone with a history of harassment and stalking. The police managed to track him down and arrest him. It turned out that he had been watching our house for weeks and had targeted us specifically. He had been using the gifts and notes as a way to gauge our reactions and get closer. After his arrest, The gifts and notes stopped. We were finally able to return to a sense of normalcy. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend in the woods. Emily and I had picked a nice spot by a lake for our camping trip. We had just finished setting up our tent and were getting ready to make dinner when we first heard the noises. At first, we thought it was just a raccoon rummaging through our supplies. It was the kind of sound you hear when something small is shuffling around. As dusk turned to dark, the noises started to get louder. It wasn't just shuffling anymore. It sounded like something or someone was moving around our campsite. Emily and I exchanged worried looks. We had heard stories of wildlife getting too close, but this sounded different. I told Emily to stay inside the tent while I went outside to check things out. I grabbed a flashlight and my pocket knife, thinking it would be enough to deal with a raccoon. As I stepped out, I scanned the area. The light from the flashlight cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything unusual. I walked around the perimeter of our site, trying to be as quiet as possible. The noises had stopped, which made me even more uneasy. I decided to check the area where we heard the most noise. As I approached the tree line, I heard whispering. It was hard to make out the words, but I could tell there were at least two people talking. I crouched down and tried to stay hidden behind some bushes. From where I was, I could see faint outlines of figures moving around. It was clear now that these were not animals, these were people. My heart began to race. I couldn't make out their faces, but they were definitely not supposed to be here. I quickly made my way back to the tent. I told Emily what I had seen and heard. She was visibly shaken. We both knew we needed to act fast. I asked her to stay quiet while I went to see if I could get a better look at what was happening. As I approached the edge of the campsite again, I saw one of the figures heading towards our cooler. The person was carrying something, maybe a bag or a large object. I couldn't see much in the dark, but I could hear the rustling of our food supplies. I decided to make a distraction. I threw a small rock towards the direction where I had seen the figures. The noise caused them to pause and look around. I used this opportunity to sneak back to the tent. Emily and I discussed what to do next. We agreed that we needed to secure our belongings and find a way to alert the authorities without getting caught. I grabbed our phone and dialed 911, but the signal was weak. I could barely make out the operator's voice, and she couldn't hear me clearly. I ended the call and told Emily we needed to leave. We would have to abandon our gear, but our safety was the priority. We decided to sneak out through the back of the campsite. We had to be very careful not to make any noise. I led Emily through the trees, trying to remember the path back to the parking area. Every small sound made me jump. I kept thinking about how close the intruders were and how dangerous this situation could be. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the parking area. I quickly started the car and drove away from the campsite. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights following us. Thankfully, there was no sign of anyone behind us. Once we were back on the main road, we found a spot with better cell service and called 911 again. This time, the operator could hear us clearly. We explained the situation and where we had been camping. The police promised to send someone out to check on the site. We spent the rest of the night in a nearby motel, still shaken by what had happened. The next day, the police contacted us to let us know that they had investigated the campsite. They found evidence of the intruders, but they were long gone by the time they arrived. We were told that the intruders might have been local troublemakers, but there was no way to be sure. The police assured us that they would increase patrols in the area. I never imagined our camping trip would turn out like this. We were relieved to be safe, but the experience left us both on edge. We decided to stick to well-populated campsites from then on. The sense of vulnerability we felt that night was something I never want to experience again. I had been driving for hours, heading through the desert on a lonely highway. It was supposed to be a straightforward trip. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. I was tired but eager to reach my destination. That's when I saw a sudden roadblock up ahead. A group of men stood beside an old truck, blocking the road. At first, I thought they might be having car trouble. As I slowed down, one of them waved me over. I hesitated but decided to stop. After all, it's not uncommon to help someone in need, especially in such a desolate place. I rolled down my window and asked if everything was all right. The man who had waved was dressed in worn-out clothes and had a gruff look. He said they were stranded and needed a ride to the nearest town. I noticed their truck was in rough shape, but it didn't seem like it would take much to fix it. They said the truck had broken down and they were waiting for a tow, but their phone was dead. They looked genuinely distressed. One of them even mentioned that they had been out here for hours and that it was getting dark. Against my better judgment, I agreed to help. I got out of my car and approached them. They seemed relieved and immediately started talking about how thankful they were. One of them, who introduced himself as Jack, began explaining their situation. It seemed a bit off, but I tried to ignore the feeling in my gut. As I was helping them, I noticed the other men were acting strangely. They kept glancing at each other and not making much eye contact with me. I started to feel uneasy. They were friendly, but something about their demeanor made me wary. I offered to let them use my phone to call for help. They seemed hesitant, but eventually, Jack took it and walked a short distance away to make the call. I watched him from a distance, trying to catch snippets of what he was saying. It sounded like he was talking to someone about their plan. When Jack returned, he said the call didn't go through and that they needed to wait a bit longer for help. I suggested we move to a safer spot away from the road. The sun was almost down, and the desert was becoming cold and dark. They agreed, and we started walking towards my car. But as I got closer, I noticed the men were now surrounding me. Their attitude had changed from thankful to something more sinister. They began asking more personal questions about where I was going and why I was alone. The realization hit me like a cold wave. They weren't stranded, they were trying to trap me. My heart raced as I tried to think of an escape plan. I subtly checked the area for any signs of escape routes or nearby help, but the desert was vast and empty. Jack suddenly mentioned that they needed to go back to the truck for something. My instinct screamed at me to get away. I politely declined and said I had to leave. The men's expressions hardened. I knew then that they had no intention of letting me go. One of them, a tall man with a menacing glare, moved closer and blocked my path. I could feel my breath quicken. I looked around for anything that could help me. The men were closing in, and I had to act fast. I made a split-second decision to run. I bolted towards my car, trying to ignore the shouting behind me. I fumbled with my keys, my hand shaking as I tried to unlock the door. I could hear the men running after me, their footsteps growing louder. I finally managed to get into the car and slam the door shut. I started the engine with a roar and quickly put the car in reverse. The men were now outside, yelling and trying to get into the car. I could see their faces through the rearview mirror, their expressions twisted with anger. I sped down the road, not looking back. The adrenaline was pumping through my veins. I kept my foot on the gas, pushing my car as fast as it would go. I drove for miles before I felt it was safe to slow down. My heart was still racing, but I was finally away from the roadblock. After I reached a safer area with more traffic, I pulled over and called the police. I reported what had happened, giving them as many details as I could. They assured me they would send a patrol to the area. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread from that encounter. I realized how quickly a seemingly harmless situation could turn dangerous. The desert was no longer just a place for me to travel through, it was a reminder of how vulnerable I had been. I made a promise to myself to always trust my instincts, no matter how polite or convincing someone might seem. The evening had started like any other. My parents had gone out for the night, leaving me home alone. I was excited about having the house to myself, planning to enjoy a quiet evening. I had just settled on the couch with my book when I heard a knock at the door. I glanced at the clock. It was a little after 7, and it was already dark outside. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I figured it might be a neighbor or a delivery. I walked to the door and peeked through the peephole. It was Mr. Johnson, our neighbor from 2 houses down. I hesitated. I remembered my parents mentioning that Mr. Johnson was supposed to be on vacation this week. I wondered why he was here. I opened the door a crack, and Mr. Johnson started speaking in a hurried tone. "There's been a gas leak in the neighborhood," he said urgently. "You need to leave the house immediately. It's not safe." I was taken aback. It didn't make sense. I had not heard anything about a gas leak from my parents or any news reports. I told Mr. Johnson I would need to call my parents first. He insisted it was not safe to waste time. His insistence made me uncomfortable. I remembered that Mr. Johnson had been talking about leaving town and that he should have been away. His tone was too urgent, almost frantic. I decided to shut the door and lock it. As I did, I heard him try to push against it. I quickly backed away from the door and grabbed my phone. I dialed 911 and explained the situation, telling them about the supposed gas leak and the fact that Mr. Johnson was not supposed to be in town. The operator assured me that help would be on the way. I moved quietly to the living room, trying to stay calm. I peeked through the blinds and saw Mr. Johnson still standing by the door, looking around. His behavior was erratic, and he seemed more agitated with every passing minute. He knocked again, more forcefully this time. "Let me in, Emily. It's not safe. You need to leave now," he shouted. I could hear the desperation in his voice, which only made me more sure that something was off. I searched for something I could use to barricade the door. I found a heavy bookshelf and pushed it against the door, hoping it would buy me some time. I turned off the lights and moved silently to the kitchen, where I could see the front door through a small window. Mr. Johnson was now pacing outside, glancing around nervously. I watched him through the window, my heart pounding in my chest. His movements became more erratic, and I could see him trying to find a way inside. He tried the door handle again, but it was locked. Minutes felt like hours. I kept checking my phone, waiting for the police to arrive. I heard Mr. Johnson making strange noises, like he was talking to himself or someone else. It was unsettling. He started trying to break a window at the side of the house. I knew I had to stay hidden. I went to the basement, the only place I could think of where he wouldn't immediately look. I grabbed a flashlight and huddled in a corner, trying to control my breathing. From the basement, I could hear Mr. Johnson moving around the house, trying to find another way in. I could hear him banging on the walls and yelling. It was clear he was getting more desperate. I stayed as quiet as possible, praying that the police would arrive soon. Every creak or bump upstairs made my heart race. I thought about what might happen if he managed to get in. Eventually, I heard sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me, but I stayed hidden until I heard the police knocking on the door. They announced themselves, and I finally made my way back upstairs. When I opened the door for them, they quickly entered the house, searching for Mr. Johnson. They found him trying to force open a window in the back. He was immediately apprehended and taken away. The police talked to me for a while, asking questions and making sure I was okay. They assured me that I did the right thing by not opening the door and calling them right away. After everything calmed down, they explained that Mr. Johnson had been reported missing and was suspected of being involved in several incidents in the area. It turned out he had been trying to target other homes, and I had narrowly avoided a dangerous situation. The house was safe again, and I felt a wave of exhaustion. I locked all the doors and made sure everything was secure. I stayed up late, waiting for my parents to come home and telling them everything that happened. We had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. Jake and I had planned it meticulously, hoping for a relaxing weekend in the Ozark National Forest. The first night was perfect. The weather was mild, and the stars shone brightly above our campsite. We roasted marshmallows and enjoyed the peace of the forest, feeling completely at ease. On the second night, things took a turn. We had just finished dinner and were sitting by the fire when we heard voices approaching. I assumed it was other campers, but Jake went to check just in case. What we didn't expect was a group of locals stumbling into our campsite. At first, they seemed friendly enough. They introduced themselves and asked if they could join us by the fire. We were happy to share our space and offered them some snacks and drinks. They were chatty and curious about us, asking where we were from and what brought us to the area. We mentioned that we were from out of state and were here to explore the Ozarks. That's when their demeanor started to shift. Their smiles faded slightly, and they exchanged glances that made me uncomfortable. One of the men, who had been particularly friendly earlier, suddenly became more stern. He asked us more pointed questions about our plans and how long we would be staying. Jake and I tried to answer calmly, but I could sense a change in the air. The atmosphere grew tense, and I started to feel uneasy. The group grew quiet, and I noticed they were no longer sitting comfortably around the fire. Instead, they were standing and moving closer to us. One of the women in the group muttered something I couldn't quite catch, but it sounded hostile. Jake's body language shifted as well, and he subtly moved closer to me. "We should probably head to bed," Jake said, trying to sound casual. He gave me a reassuring look and stood up, signaling that we should pack up. I nodded, though my heart was racing. I could tell that something was wrong. Before we could react, one of the men spoke up, his voice cold. "You're not from around here, are you?" Jake tried to explain that we were just tourists and had no intention of causing any trouble. But the locals didn't seem convinced. Their faces hardened, and one of them started to approach us with a menacing look. Jake and I exchanged worried glances. It was clear that this situation was escalating, and we needed to get out of there. We started gathering our things as quickly as we could, but the locals weren't backing off. Suddenly, one of the men grabbed a nearby branch and swung it in our direction. The aggressive move caught us off guard. Jake shouted at me to run, and I didn't hesitate. We grabbed our essentials and fled into the dark forest, leaving the campsite behind. The forest was pitch black, and the only light came from the distant moon and our flashlights. We ran as fast as we could, trying to navigate the rough terrain. Branches and underbrush scratched at our legs, and the sound of our pursuers grew louder behind us. I could hear them shouting and cursing, their footsteps crunching through the leaves. It was terrifying, not knowing how close they were or what they intended to do. Jake kept a tight grip on my hand, leading me through the forest. We tried to stay as quiet as possible, hoping to put some distance between us and the group. We stumbled through the woods, trying to find any sign of a trail or a way to escape. Every now and then, we would hear a crack or snap of a twig that made us freeze in fear. We were both out of breath and exhausted, but we knew we had to keep moving. After what felt like hours of running, we found a small cave. It wasn't much, but it was a place to hide. We crawled inside and tried to catch our breath. The sound of our pursuers was distant now, but we knew they could still be out there looking for us. We stayed in the cave, keeping as quiet as possible. I could hear Jake's rapid breathing next to me, and I tried to steady my own. We used our phones to check for signal, hoping to call for help, but there was no reception in the area. Time seemed to drag on. We occasionally heard noises outside, but nothing close. After a few hours, the sounds of our pursuers faded completely. Jake and I were both shivering from the cold and fear. Once we felt it was safe, we cautiously left the cave and made our way back to where we thought the campsite had been. We were relieved to see that the group of locals had left. Our campsite was a mess, but our gear was still there. We packed up quickly and decided to leave the forest. We drove back to civilization, relieved to be out of danger. Once we were in a safe area with a cell signal, we called the local authorities and reported the incident. They assured us they would look into it, but we didn't want to stick around to see what happened next. The experience left us shaken, but we were grateful that we managed to escape unharmed. We talked about what happened, and I couldn't shake the fear from my mind. We both agreed that we would never go camping in that area again. Even now, thinking back on that night gives me chills. I was working late at my downtown Chicago apartment, trying to finish up some reports. The city outside was quiet, and I was focused on my screen. Around midnight, I heard a faint scratching noise coming from near my front door. I paused, listening carefully, but couldn't hear anything else. I figured it was just the wind or maybe a stray cat. I tried to push it out of my mind and went back to work. A few minutes later, I heard a louder noise. It was unmistakably the sound of my door being forced open. My heart raced as I realized someone was breaking in. I grabbed my laptop and shut it down, the soft hum of the computer stopping abruptly. I turned off all the lights, plunging the apartment into darkness. I rushed to my bedroom and quickly hid in the closet. My breathing was heavy, and I had to force myself to stay quiet. I could hear footsteps moving around the apartment, getting louder as they approached. The sound of furniture being knocked over and drawers being pulled open filled the space. The closet door had slats that let me see out into the room, but I had to stay perfectly still. I watched as two men came into view. They were wearing masks, so I couldn't see their faces. They moved with purpose, tossing aside books and rifling through drawers. I could hear their low, gruff voices as they talked to each other, discussing what they were looking for. My phone was on the coffee table in the living room, just a few feet away from where the men were searching. I needed to find a way to call for help, but I couldn't risk making any noise. I felt a wave of panic as I considered my options. If I tried to sneak out, they might hear me and catch me in the act. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. One of the intruders walked over to the coffee table and picked up my phone. My heart sank as I realized he was holding it, examining it. I could see the screen lighting up briefly, probably because of a notification. He put it back down, and I let out a quiet sigh of relief. But my situation was still dire. The men continued to search the apartment, and their conversation became more heated. They were clearly frustrated that they couldn't find what they were looking for. I overheard them mention something about a safe and how they had been told it was here. I didn't have a safe, but it was clear they were convinced they had the right place. I knew I had to act quickly. I reached into the closet and found a small box of old office supplies. I took a deep breath and decided to use one of the pens from the box. I quietly unscrewed the pen and took out the spring inside. Using the spring and a piece of string from the box, I tried to make a makeshift signal. It wasn't much, but if I could throw it close enough to the phone, maybe I could use the vibration to attract attention. I carefully and quietly threw the spring and string towards the living room. It landed with a soft thud on the carpet. I held my breath, hoping it would make enough noise to alert the intruders, but not so much that it would make them suspicious. The men were still arguing about the safe, and I heard one of them curse loudly in frustration. After a tense few minutes, one of the men noticed the string and picked it up. I watched as he examined it, clearly puzzled. He seemed to lose interest quickly and tossed it aside. I was back to square one, but I couldn't give up. I needed to find another way. I noticed that the men were starting to get more desperate. Their search was becoming more frantic, and they were now overturning furniture. I decided to try another tactic. I slowly moved to the edge of the closet and looked for something I could use as a distraction. I spotted an old alarm clock on the shelf above me. I grabbed the alarm clock and, with great care, set the time to ring in a few minutes. I then placed it on the edge of the closet, where it would fall out if I nudged it. I slowly moved it just enough so that when the clock went off, it would make a noise and hopefully draw the men's attention. The minutes ticked by slowly. My hands were clammy, and my heart felt like it was going to burst from my chest. When the alarm clock finally went off, it made a loud ringing noise. The intruders stopped their search and turned towards the sound. I could see them moving quickly to the source of the noise. I took the opportunity to slowly and quietly crawl out of the closet. My heart was pounding as I tried to stay as silent as possible. I moved towards the coffee table, hoping the men would be too distracted by the noise to notice me. I reached for my phone, but my fingers fumbled, and it almost slipped off the table. I grabbed it just in time and dialed 911. I kept my voice low, whispering to the operator about the situation and my location. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but it could take a few minutes. I ended the call and tried to remain as quiet as possible. The men were still searching the apartment, but their movements were now more hurried. I knew I had to stay hidden until the police arrived. I crawled behind the couch and held my breath, listening to the chaos around me. Minutes felt like hours. The sounds of the men's footsteps grew more distant, and I could hear sirens approaching in the distance. The intruders finally started to leave the apartment, their voices fading away. I waited until the apartment was silent again before cautiously emerging from my hiding spot. I saw the flashing lights of police cars outside the window and knew help had arrived. I opened the door and quickly let the officers in. They went through the apartment, checking for any remaining intruders and assessing the damage. They assured me that it was safe to come out now and started taking statements. I was shaken but relieved. The officers were thorough and checked the apartment for any signs of further tampering. They were able to catch up with the intruders later, thanks to the quick response to my call. That night was one of the scariest experiences of my life. I had never imagined that a simple noise could lead to such a dangerous situation. I had been hiking all day, and the rain started coming down hard as evening approached. I was in the middle of the woods, far from any town or road. The trail was muddy, and I was soaked. I needed to find shelter quickly. That's when I saw the cabin through the trees. It looked old and abandoned, but it was better than being out in the storm. I pushed through the wet underbrush and reached the cabin. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, it was dark and smelled musty. I shook off the rain and stepped in, hoping to find a dry spot to rest. I found an old chair and a table, some broken shelves, and a small fireplace. There were no lights, but I had a flashlight in my pack. I set my things down and explored a bit. The cabin was just one room, with a couple of small windows. The rain pounded on the roof, and the wind howled outside. I felt a bit uneasy, but it was better than being out in the storm. I decided to make a small fire to warm up and dry off. As I was gathering some old wood from a pile in the corner, I noticed something odd. There were fresh food wrappers and an empty water bottle under the table. It looked like someone had been here recently. My heart started to race. What if they came back? I tried to calm myself, thinking it could have been a hiker like me, seeking shelter from the rain. I lit the fire and warmed my hands. The small flickering flames cast shadows on the walls, making the cabin feel even more eerie. I decided to stay close to the door, just in case. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and it was getting darker. I sat in the chair, trying to relax, but every creak and groan of the cabin made me jump. A loud noise from outside made me freeze. I turned off my flashlight and listened. Footsteps. Someone was coming. Panic set in. I looked around for a place to hide. There was a small closet near the back wall. I grabbed my things and slipped inside, closing the door as quietly as I could. I could hear voices now, muffled by the rain. Two men, talking and laughing. The door creaked open, and I held my breath. They stomped inside, shaking off the rain. I peeked through a crack in the closet door and saw them clearly. They were big, rough-looking men, and they carried guns. They started talking about a deal, something about money and a meeting place. My heart pounded in my chest. These weren't just hikers. They were criminals. I was trapped in their hideout, and they had no idea I was there. I needed to get out, but how? One of the men walked over to the fireplace, noticing the warm embers. "Someone's been here," he said, his voice gruff. My stomach dropped. They knew. I tried to stay as still and quiet as possible, but my mind was racing. What would they do if they found me? The other man cursed and started looking around. I could hear them opening drawers and moving things. They were getting closer to the closet. I pressed myself against the back wall, praying they wouldn't find me. The door handle turned, and I held my breath. The door swung open, and I saw the man's face. He froze for a second, then his eyes widened. "What the hell?" he shouted, reaching for me. I didn't think, just acted. I shoved past him, knocking him off balance, and ran for the door. The other man shouted and lunged at me, but I ducked and sprinted out into the rain. I didn't look back. I just ran. The rain was blinding, and the forest was dark, but I kept going. I could hear them behind me, crashing through the trees, shouting. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they would give out, but I didn't stop. I needed to find help, get away from them. I stumbled down a hill, slipping in the mud, and crashed into a stream. The cold water shocked me, but I kept going, following the stream, hoping it would lead me to safety. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, and I risked a glance back. They weren't there. I kept moving, more carefully now, trying to stay hidden. The stream led to a dirt road, and I followed it, praying for a car or a house, anything. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights. I waved frantically, and the car stopped. It was a ranger. I told him everything, barely able to speak from exhaustion and fear. He took me to the nearest station, where I finally felt safe. They never found the men or the cabin. I still think about that night, how close I came to being caught. I haven't been back to the woods since. It was pouring rain that night, the kind of rain that makes it hard to see even with the wipers on full speed. I was driving back home from my mom's place with my daughter, Lily, in the back seat. The road was slick, and the wind was howling through the trees lining the narrow road. We were about 10 miles from home when the car suddenly skidded. I tried to correct the steering, but it was too late. The car slid off the road and into a ditch, sinking into the mud with a sickening thud. Lily was scared but unhurt, thank God. I tried to drive out, but the tires just spun in the mud. I reached for my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I told Lily to stay in the car while I checked if there was any way to get the car moving. As I stepped out, the rain drenched me instantly. The mud was thick and sticky, clinging to my shoes with every step. I was inspecting the tires when I saw headlights approaching. A wave of relief washed over me. Maybe they could help pull us out. The car stopped, and a man stepped out. He was tall and had a hood pulled over his head, making it hard to see his face. "Need some help?" he called out over the sound of the rain. "Yes, please," I replied. "My car's stuck in the mud. Can you help us?" He walked over, and as he got closer, I felt a strange sense of unease. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. But I was desperate. "I have a rope in my truck," he said. "I can pull you out." He went back to his truck, and I turned to check on Lily. She was watching from the back seat, her wide eyes filled with worry. I tried to smile reassuringly, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The man came back with a rope and started attaching it to the front of my car. He worked in silence, his movements quick and precise. Once he was done, he got back into his truck and started pulling. The car lurched forward, but it didn't budge much. The mud was too deep. He got out of the truck again and walked over. "It's not working," he said, his tone flat. "We'll need to try something else." I nodded, unsure of what to say. He walked closer, and I noticed a glint in his eyes that sent a chill down my spine. "Why don't you and the kid come wait in my truck? It's warm and dry." Something about his suggestion set off alarm bells in my head. "No, we're fine," I said quickly. "We'll stay here." His expression darkened. "It's not safe out here," he insisted, stepping closer. "You need to come with me." I took a step back, my heart pounding. "No, thank you," I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll be fine." He grabbed my arm, his grip tight and painful. "I'm not asking," he growled. "You're coming with me." Panic surged through me. I twisted out of his grip and ran to the car, locking the doors behind me. Lily was crying, and I tried to calm her down while fumbling for my phone. Still no signal. The man was pounding on the window now, shouting for me to open the door. I ignored him and started the car, hoping against hope that we could somehow get free. The tires spun uselessly, and I felt tears of frustration and fear welling up. Then, a miracle. Another set of headlights appeared down the road. The man stopped pounding and turned to face the new car. I honked the horn desperately, hoping to get their attention. The car stopped, and two men got out. They looked from me to the man and seemed to understand the situation immediately. "Is there a problem here?" one of them called out. The man backed away from the window, muttering something under his breath. He glanced at me one last time, his eyes full of anger, before walking back to his truck. He drove off without another word. The two men walked over to my car. "Are you okay?" one of them asked. I nodded, still shaken. "Yes, thank you." He was trying to get us to go with him. They looked at each other and then back at me. "Let's get you out of here," the other man said. They hooked up their truck to my car and managed to pull it free from the mud. Once we were back on the road, I thanked them repeatedly. They offered to follow us home to make sure we got there safely, and I gratefully accepted. Lily was still scared, but I promised her we were safe now. We made it home without any further incidents. I never found out who that man was or what he wanted, but I'm grateful to those two men who showed up when they did. I arrived at the Airbnb late, the rain pouring down in sheets. It had been a long drive, and all I wanted was to get inside and dry off. The place looked cozy in the pictures, and when I finally pulled up, it seemed all right. A small cottage tucked away from the main road, lights glowing warmly inside. I grabbed my bags and hurried to the door. The owner, Paul, greeted me. He seemed friendly enough, though there was something about his smile that made me uneasy. I brushed it off as paranoia. It had been a stressful week. I thanked him, took the keys, and stepped inside. The place was charming, just like the photos. Rustic furniture, a fireplace, and the soft patter of rain on the roof. I unpacked my things and tried to relax, but the unease lingered. I chalked it up to the storm outside and decided to take a shower. After I finished, I went to lock the front door. That's when I noticed it. The lock was on the outside. My heart skipped a beat. I checked the other doors and windows. All of them had the same setup. Locks on the outside, none on the inside. Panic set in. I tried calling Paul, but my phone had no signal. The Wi-Fi wasn't working either. I felt trapped. The rain pounded harder, and the wind howled through the trees. I needed to think. I needed to find a way out without letting him know I was onto him. I remembered seeing a small window in the bathroom that might be big enough to crawl through. Quietly, I made my way there. I tried opening it, but it was painted shut. I started to panic again, but I knew I had to stay calm. I looked around for something to break the glass. There was a heavy candle holder on the sink. I grabbed it and, with a silent prayer, swung it at the window. The glass shattered, and I froze, listening for any signs that Paul had heard. Nothing. I cleared away the shards and tried to squeeze through. It was a tight fit, but I managed to get my upper body out. That's when I heard footsteps. I scrambled, pushing myself the rest of the way out. I fell into the mud outside, the rain soaking me instantly. I didn't have time to think about it. I got up and ran. The trees were dense, and the darkness made it hard to see. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my heart pounding in my chest. I heard a door slam behind me and knew Paul was coming. I had to keep moving. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. I found a small clearing and hid behind a fallen log, trying to catch my breath. I could hear Paul shouting, calling my name, his voice getting closer. I needed to find help, but I didn't know where I was. I decided to keep heading away from the cottage, hoping I'd find a road or another house. I moved as quietly as I could, every sound making my heart race. After what felt like hours, I saw lights through the trees. A house. I crept closer, praying someone was home. I reached the edge of the yard and saw a car in the driveway. I ran to the front door and banged on it, hoping whoever was inside would help me. The door opened, and an older woman stood there, looking confused and worried. I tried to explain what happened, but I was out of breath and soaking wet. She let me in and called the police. I could hear Paul's shouts in the distance, but I knew I was safe now. The police arrived quickly, and I told them everything. They found Paul searching the woods near the cottage. He tried to deny everything, but they found evidence in the house that backed up my story. Hidden cameras, restraints, things that made my skin crawl. I never found out what Paul's true intentions were, and I didn't want to. I just wanted to forget the whole ordeal. The police assured me he would be locked up for a long time, but it didn't make me feel much better. The rain had stopped by the time I left the police station. A friend picked me up and drove me home. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to every creak and rustle, afraid that somehow Paul would find me. I knew it was irrational, but after that night, I couldn't help but feel that I was never truly safe. I was staying at this hotel for a business trip. It wasn't anything fancy, but it seemed decent enough when I checked in. The first night went by without any issues. I attended my meetings and came back to the room to crash. The next night, though, things took a turn. It was past midnight when I realized I left my phone charger in my car. I decided to go get it because my phone was almost dead. I put on my shoes, grabbed my key card, and headed out. The hallway was empty and quiet, and the only sound was the hum of the vending machine near the elevator. I took the elevator down to the parking lot, got my charger, and headed back up to my room. When I got to my door, I swiped the key card, but the light flashed red. I tried again, thinking maybe I swiped it too fast. Still red. I tried a few more times, but it didn't work. Frustrated, I decided to go down to the front desk to get a new key. When I got there, the lobby was empty. No one was at the front desk. I rang the bell, but no one came. I called out, "Hello?" but still, no response. It was late, and I was getting annoyed. I walked around, trying to find someone. The hallways were dimly lit, and the whole place felt eerie. After what felt like forever, I finally saw a guy in a hotel uniform coming out of a door near the laundry room. I called out to him, and he turned to look at me. He smiled and walked over. "Hey, can I help you?" he asked. I told him my key card wasn't working, and I couldn't get into my room. He nodded and said he could help me. He asked for my room number, and I told him. He said he would get a new key card for me. He led me to a back office, saying the system was there, not at the front desk. It seemed odd, but I was tired and just wanted to get back to my room. The office was down a narrow hallway, away from the main lobby. He unlocked the door and gestured for me to go in first. I stepped inside, and that's when I realized something was wrong. The office was messy, with papers everywhere and no computer in sight. Before I could react, I heard the door close behind me. I turned around, and the guy was blocking the doorway. His friendly smile was gone. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, and I backed away until I hit the desk. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. "Just give me your wallet and phone," he said finally, his voice low and menacing. I realized then that this was a setup. He must have seen me leave my room and decided to take advantage of the situation. I handed over my wallet and phone, hoping that would be enough for him to leave me alone. He took them and then looked me over. "Empty your pockets," he demanded. I did as he said, showing him I had nothing else. He seemed satisfied and finally stepped back, opening the door. "Don't make a sound," he warned, "or you'll regret it." I nodded, and he left, closing the door behind him. I waited a few moments, heart pounding, then slowly opened the door. The hallway was empty. I crept back to the lobby, looking around for anyone who could help. The place was still deserted. I finally found a house phone and called the main line. After a few rings, the same guy answered. "Front desk, how can I help you?" he said, his voice back to being friendly. I hung up, realizing he was the only staff around. Desperate, I went back to my room and tried the keycard again. This time, the door clicked open. I quickly went inside and locked the door behind me. I sat on the bed, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. In the morning, I went to the front desk and reported everything. They seemed shocked and promised to look into it. They gave me back my wallet and phone, which had been found in a trash can outside. I checked out and moved to a different hotel for the rest of my stay. I never saw that guy again, and the hotel never gave me a clear explanation. But I learned to always be cautious, especially when traveling alone. I rented an isolated Airbnb for a weekend getaway. I wanted some peace and quiet. The place was perfect, a small cabin surrounded by woods. The host, Jim, seemed friendly at first. He greeted me with a big smile and showed me around. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fireplace, reading a book and enjoying the solitude. The cabin was cozy, and the woods were silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves. I went to bed early, feeling relaxed. The next morning, Jim showed up unannounced. He said he was checking to make sure everything was all right. It seemed a bit strange, but I didn't think much of it. He left after a few minutes, and I went about my day. Later that afternoon, I went for a hike. The trails around the cabin were beautiful. When I returned, I found Jim sitting on the porch. He said he was waiting to ask if I needed anything. I assured him I was fine and thanked him. He left, but I started feeling uneasy. That evening, I cooked dinner and tried to relax. Around 8 p.m., there was a knock at the door. It was Jim again. He said he wanted to make sure I was comfortable. I felt a bit creeped out but didn't want to be rude. I thanked him and closed the door. The next morning, I woke up to find Jim outside, walking around the cabin. I watched him through the window for a while. He seemed to be inspecting the place. I decided to confront him. When I stepped outside, he smiled and said he was just making sure everything was in order. I told him I appreciated his concern but needed some privacy. That afternoon, I tried to call a friend, but there was no cell service. I hadn't noticed before, but the cabin was in a dead zone. I felt isolated and uneasy. I decided to leave the next day, cutting my trip short. That night, I heard footsteps outside the cabin. I looked out the window and saw Jim walking around again. He was holding something that looked like a tool. I locked the doors and windows, my heart pounding. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, Jim showed up again. He knocked on the door, and when I didn't answer, he started shouting. He demanded to be let in, saying he needed to check something inside. I told him to go away, but he kept shouting. I realized I was trapped. There was no way to call for help, and Jim was getting more aggressive. I decided to make a run for it. I packed a bag quickly and snuck out the back door while he was still pounding on the front. I ran through the woods, trying to stay quiet. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away from the cabin. After a while, I found a road. I followed it until I reached a small town. I went to the nearest store and asked to use the phone. I called the police and told them what happened. They took my statement and said they would check on the cabin. I felt relieved but still shaken. The police found Jim at the cabin. They said he was acting erratic and had a history of mental illness. They took him into custody and assured me he wouldn't bother me again. I was safe, but the experience left me rattled. I couldn't believe how quickly things had escalated. I was home alone during summer break. My parents were on a trip, and I had the house to myself. It was late, and I was lying in bed, almost asleep. Suddenly, I heard glass shattering downstairs. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to listen. I thought it might be a dream, but then I heard footsteps. I got out of bed quietly and crept to my bedroom door. I opened it a crack and peeked out into the hallway. It was dark and silent, but I could hear the faint sounds of movement downstairs. I needed to get my phone to call the police, but I had left it in the living room. I cursed myself for being so careless. I tiptoed out of my room and headed for the stairs, careful to avoid the creaky spots on the floor. As I got closer to the stairs, I heard voices. Two men were talking in hushed tones. They sounded like they were searching for something. I crouched down and peeked through the banister. I could see shadows moving in the living room. I needed to find a way to get to my phone without being seen. I decided to go through the kitchen, which had a door that led to the living room. I slowly made my way downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the kitchen and paused, listening. The men were still in the living room, their voices low but urgent. I moved quietly, inching towards the kitchen door. I opened it slowly, hoping it wouldn't creak. I could see the living room now. One of the men was rummaging through drawers, while the other was looking at the shelves. My phone was on the coffee table, just a few feet away from them. I took a deep breath and crawled on the floor, staying as low as possible. I moved slowly, my eyes never leaving the burglars. I was almost at the coffee table when one of them turned around. I froze, my heart stopping. He looked right at me, but he didn't seem to see me. I stayed perfectly still, praying he wouldn't notice. After a moment, he turned back to his search. I reached the coffee table and grabbed my phone. I crawled back to the kitchen, my heart still racing. I made it to the kitchen and closed the door behind me as quietly as I could. I dialed 911, my hands shaking. I whispered to the operator, telling them about the burglars. They said they would send officers right away and told me to stay hidden. I found a spot behind the kitchen counter where I could watch the living room door. I waited, my phone clutched in my hand. The burglars were still searching, oblivious to my presence. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. I heard one of the burglars say they needed to hurry up. They sounded frustrated, like they weren't finding what they were looking for. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. The burglars heard them too and panicked. They grabbed a few things and ran towards the back door. I stayed hidden, not daring to move. I heard the back door slam and the sound of footsteps running away. The sirens grew louder, and soon I saw flashing lights outside. The police had arrived. I stayed behind the counter until I heard the police calling out, announcing their presence. I stood up and walked to the front door, my legs shaky. I opened the door and saw two officers standing there. They asked if I was okay, and I nodded, feeling a rush of relief. I told them what had happened, and they searched the house to make sure the burglars were gone. They took my statement and said they would investigate. I called my parents and told them what had happened. They were worried but glad I was safe. I spent the rest of the night in a daze, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. The police never caught the burglars, but they said I did the right thing by staying hidden and calling for help. It was a terrifying experience, and I was just glad it was over. My car broke down in the middle of nowhere. The road was empty, and my phone had no signal. I tried to restart the engine, but it just wouldn't turn over. I got out and looked under the hood, but I didn't know what I was looking at. It was just a mess of metal and wires to me. I was starting to panic when I saw headlights approaching. I waved my arms, hoping they would stop. The car slowed down and pulled over. A man rolled down his window and asked if I needed help. I told him my car wouldn't start, and I needed a tow truck. He looked at my car and said he could give me a ride to the nearest town. I hesitated, but it was getting late, and I didn't want to be stranded all night. I thanked him and got in. He seemed friendly enough, middle-aged, with a kind smile. We drove for a few minutes in silence. Then he started asking me questions. Where was I from? What was I doing out here? I answered politely, but something about his tone made me uneasy. He was too interested, too eager to know everything about me. I noticed we were heading in the opposite direction of the nearest town. I told him he was going the wrong way. He glanced at me and smiled, but didn't turn around. He said he knew a shortcut. My stomach twisted. Something was off. I asked him again to turn around, but he ignored me. I reached for my phone, hoping to find a signal, but there was none. He noticed and chuckled, saying it was pointless out here. My heart was pounding. I had to get out of this car. I told him to stop and let me out. He just kept driving, his smile gone now, replaced with a cold, hard look. I grabbed the door handle, but it wouldn't open. Child locks. My panic rose. I was trapped. I started yelling at him, demanding he let me out. He laughed, a low, chilling sound. He said I wasn't going anywhere. I looked around the car, desperate for something to defend myself with. There was nothing. Just an old blanket on the back seat. We drove deeper into the woods, away from the main road. The trees closed in around us, blocking out the moonlight. It was dark, and I couldn't see a way out. He pulled the car over and turned off the engine. The silence was deafening. He turned to me, his eyes cold and empty. He said I was going to do exactly what he said, or things would get ugly. I was shaking, my mind racing for a way out. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a knife. My blood ran cold. He ordered me to get out of the car. I hesitated, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't bluffing. I opened the door and stepped out, my legs trembling. He got out too, holding the knife casually, like it was just an extension of his hand. He told me to start walking. I asked where, but he just pointed deeper into the woods. I started walking, my mind frantically searching for a way to escape. The underbrush was thick, and the trees loomed overhead, blocking out the stars. I heard him walking behind me, his footsteps crunching on the leaves. I needed to do something, anything. I stumbled over a root and fell, and in that moment, I made a decision. I grabbed a handful of dirt and leaves and threw it in his face. He yelled, stumbling back, and I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran as fast as I could. Branches scratched my face, and my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I could hear him behind me, cursing and crashing through the underbrush. I saw a light ahead, a small cabin in the woods. I sprinted towards it, praying someone was home. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. The door opened, and an old man stood there, a shotgun in his hands. He took one look at me and then passed me to the man chasing me. The old man raised his shotgun and fired a warning shot into the air. The man chasing me stopped, his face twisted in rage. He turned and fled back into the woods. The old man pulled me inside and locked the door. I collapsed on the floor, shaking and crying. He called the police, and they came and took my statement. They searched the woods but didn't find the man. Every evening when I walked home from work, I noticed a man staring at me from across the street. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. People look at other people all the time, right? But after a week, it became clear that this wasn't just random. He was always there, same time, same place, just staring. He never smiled or waved, just watched. It was creepy, but I told myself not to worry. I lived in a busy neighborhood, and nothing bad had ever happened to me there. I kept my head down and hurried home, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of my neck every time I passed him. One Friday evening, it was darker than usual, and the streets were quieter. As I walked past his usual spot, I noticed he wasn't there. Relief washed over me, and I quickened my pace, eager to get home. But as I turned the corner to my building, I saw him again, leaning against the wall, staring right at me. I froze for a moment, then forced myself to keep walking. I could feel his eyes following me. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled with my keys, finally getting the door open. I glanced back and saw him crossing the street, heading straight for me. Panic set in. I rushed inside and slammed the door shut, leaning against it, trying to catch my breath. I ran up the stairs to my apartment on the 3rd floor. I locked the door behind me and went straight to the window. Peeking through the blinds, I saw him standing outside, looking up at the building. He had followed me. He knew where I lived. Fear gripped me. What did he want? Why was he following me? I didn't sleep much that night. Every little noise made me jump. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That a man was staring at me? That he followed me home? They would probably tell me there was nothing they could do. The next day, I decided to change my routine. I left work earlier, hoping to avoid him. It worked for a few days, but then he was there again, waiting for me. This time, I didn't go straight home. I walked past my building and went to a nearby cafe. I sat there for hours, watching the door, waiting to see if he would come in. He didn't, but when I finally left, he was there, across the street, watching. I couldn't live like this. I felt trapped in my own home, scared to go outside. I needed to do something. I decided to confront him. Maybe if I showed him I wasn't afraid, he would leave me alone. The next evening, I saw him in his usual spot. I walked straight up to him, my hands shaking, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "Why are you following me?" I demanded. He just stared at me, not saying a word. Up close, he looked even more menacing. His eyes were cold and empty. He didn't answer. He just kept staring. "Leave me alone," I said, louder this time. People on the street were starting to look. "I'm calling the police if you don't stop." He smirked then, a slow, unsettling smile. "You should be careful," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You never know who might be watching." I backed away, my heart racing. I didn't look back as I hurried to my building. Once inside, I locked the door and called the police. They came and took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. They said they would patrol the area more often, but without a direct threat, there was little they could do. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and fear. I avoided going out as much as possible. When I did, I made sure I wasn't alone. I told my neighbors and the building manager about the man, and they promised to keep an eye out. One night, as I was about to go to bed, I heard a noise outside my door. My blood ran cold. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. There he was, standing right outside, trying to pick the lock. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering frantically to the operator. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. I could hear him messing with the lock, getting closer to breaking in. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't get in before help arrived. Finally, I heard sirens and the sound of footsteps running up the stairs. The man turned and fled, but the police were right behind him. They caught him before he could get away. The police found a knife in his pocket and a piece of paper with my address on it. They arrested him, and I pressed charges. He had a record of stalking and assault, and it turned out he had been following me for weeks, planning to break in and who knows what else. It took a while for me to feel safe again. I installed extra locks on my door and set up a security system. I still jump at every little noise, but I'm getting better. I'm just glad he's behind bars and can't hurt me. I was driving alone on a long stretch of highway. The rain started coming down harder, making it difficult to see. The windshield wipers were going full speed, but it didn't seem to help much. The road was nearly deserted, and I felt a bit uneasy. It was the kind of night that made you wish you weren't alone. I saw a figure on the side of the road, drenched and holding out a thumb. Normally, I wouldn't pick up a hitchhiker, but the weather was awful, and I felt a pang of sympathy. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" I asked. He smiled, his face partly hidden by the hood of his jacket. "Yes, please. It's miserable out here." He climbed in, bringing a wave of cold, wet air with him. I turned up the heat and started driving again. We exchanged small talk at first. His name was Mike. He seemed friendly enough, talking about the weather and his bad luck with his car breaking down. I felt more relaxed with him in the car, the company breaking the monotony of the drive. But as the rain got heavier, something in his demeanor changed. His responses became shorter, his tone more serious. I tried to keep the conversation going, but it felt forced. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. Suddenly, he reached over and locked the car doors. I glanced at him, my heart starting to race. "Why did you do that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "For safety," he replied, but there was something unsettling in his voice. He turned to face me, his eyes cold and calculating. "Keep driving." Fear gripped me. "What's going on?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He pulled a knife from his jacket and held it up where I could see it. "Just keep driving," he said calmly. "And don't do anything stupid." My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The rain was pounding on the roof, the road a blur in the headlights. I had to stay calm, had to think. "Where are we going?" I asked, hoping to buy some time. "There's a rest area a few miles up the road." "Pull in there," he ordered. I nodded, trying to keep my breathing steady. The rest area wasn't far, and I had to find a way to escape before we got there. I kept glancing at the road, looking for any opportunity. The rain made it hard to see, but I noticed a small dirt road coming up on the right. Without warning, I yanked the wheel and turned onto the dirt road. The car skidded in the mud, and Mike cursed, grabbing the dashboard for support. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted. I didn't answer. I just kept driving, the car bouncing and sliding on the rough road. I could hear him fumbling with the knife, trying to steady himself. The dirt road wound through the trees, and I hoped it would lead to somewhere safe. "Stop the car," he demanded, his voice full of anger. He lunged at me, and I swerved, trying to throw him off balance. The knife grazed my arm, and I cried out in pain. I slammed on the brakes, the car sliding to a stop. I grabbed my bleeding arm and looked at him. He was panting, the knife still in his hand. "Get out," he ordered, pointing the knife at me. I didn't move. "Please, just let me go," I pleaded. He shook his head. "Get out," he repeated, more forcefully. I slowly opened the door and stepped out into the rain. It was freezing, the water soaking through my clothes instantly. Mike got out on his side, keeping the knife pointed at me. "Walk," he said, nodding toward the trees. I started walking, my mind racing. The rain was so heavy I could barely see a few feet ahead. I had to find a way to escape, to get away from him. He was right behind me, the knife glinting in the dim light. We walked for what felt like hours, the mud sucking at my shoes, the rain relentless. My arm throbbed where he had cut me, and I was starting to feel dizzy. I had to do something, had to find a way to get away. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a rustling in the trees. I stopped, turning to look. Mike grabbed my arm, pulling me forward. "Keep moving," he snapped. But the noise came again, closer this time. It sounded like footsteps. I glanced around, trying to see through the rain. "Someone's coming," I said, hoping it was true. Mike looked around, his grip on my arm tightening. "Shut up," he hissed. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could see a light bobbing through the trees. Mike cursed, pulling me toward the car. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice panicked. I saw my chance. I twisted out of his grip and ran toward the light, screaming for help. "Help! Please, help me!" The light stopped, and I heard a voice call out. "Who's there?" Mike was right behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, the mud and rain slowing me down. I could hear him cursing, struggling to keep up. I burst through the trees and saw a figure holding a flashlight. It was a man, a hunter by the looks of it. "Help me!" I cried, running toward him. He looked confused for a moment, then saw Mike coming after me. He raised the flashlight, shining it in Mike's face. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Mike stopped, the knife still in his hand. "Just a misunderstanding," he said, trying to sound calm. The hunter wasn't buying it. He raised his rifle, pointing it at Mike. "Drop the knife," he ordered. Mike hesitated, then dropped the knife in the mud. The hunter kept the rifle trained on him, his eyes narrowing. "You okay, miss?" he asked me. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "Thank you," I whispered. The hunter kept the rifle on Mike as he called the police. They arrived quickly, taking Mike into custody. I was safe, but I knew I would never forget that night, the terror and the rain. I would never pick up a hitchhiker again. Not even for $1 million.